The Strange Man in the Vacant Lot. Lucas and his fiancée, Emily, decided to spend a weekend getaway at Lucas's family cabin deep in the woods. They enjoyed outdoor activities like hiking, fishing, and four-wheeling, making the most of the peaceful atmosphere the cabin provided. On the last day, Emily and Lucas's family decided to leave early, while the couple chose to stay behind for some quiet time before heading home that evening. As the sun set, Lucas and Emily packed their belongings into the truck and began driving down the dirt road leading out of the property. The road was surrounded by dense forest, and they had to pass through 5 gates along the way, each secured with a lock that Lucas had to unlock and relock as they passed. When they reached the 4th gate, something felt different. It was located in a large clearing, allowing the landscape to be clearly visible under the moonlight. Still, something about it unsettled him, as if an unseen threat lurked nearby. He unlocked the gate and drove through, but as he turned back to lock it again, he noticed a strange light in the distance. A flashlight beam flickered through the trees, and the silhouette of a man appeared. Lucas hesitated, watching the figure for a moment, but dismissed it, assuming it was just another property owner. However, just as Lucas began locking the gate, he heard a voice calling for help. Squinting into the darkness, he called out,
"Hey, are you okay?"
and slowly stepped toward the flashlight. At that moment, the flashlight jerked wildly in all directions. Lucas could see the figure sprinting toward them, but the man wasn't shouting, he was just running. The man was dressed in dark clothing and carried a backpack. Panic surged through Lucas, and he rushed back to the truck. He jumped in and sped off, trying to stay calm, telling Emily that he had just been startled. He drove about a quarter of a mile before reaching the final gate. Putting the truck in park, he hesitated for a moment, glancing back toward where he had seen the man. Seeing nothing, he stepped out and walked toward the gate. Then, in the distance, a flickering light appeared again. It was him. The man was coming. He appeared once again, sprinting toward them. Summoning his courage, Lucas shouted,
"Do you need help?"
hoping the man would stop and respond. But nothing changed. But this time, he didn't run toward Lucas like before. Instead, he charged straight at the truck where Emily was sitting. She was in danger. Emily, now seeing the man in the rearview mirror, asked Lucas to check if he needed help. Lucas called back, revealing his earlier encounter, and they both realized the man was likely chasing them. This was a serious threat.
"Lucas, we have to go!"
Emily screamed. Emily shrieked as the man sprinted toward the truck, grabbing the door handle and yanking it violently, trying to force it open. Lucas acted on instinct. He rushed to the back of the truck, yanked open the toolbox, and grabbed a tire iron. He swung the metal bar down onto the man's wrist with a sickening crack. The man let out a pained scream. He stumbled backward, his arm hanging limply at his side. But instead of running, he just smiled, a twisted, unsettling grin. And then, he stepped forward again. Lucas jumped back into the truck, slammed the door shut, and floored the gas. The truck shot forward, kicking up dirt as they sped through the final gate. Emily twisted in her seat, looking out the back window in terror. "What the hell just happened?" she asked. But Lucas had no answer. He had no idea what or who that man was. Lucas glanced at the rearview mirror. The man stood in the middle of the road, not running, not moving, just smiling. When they reached the main highway, Lucas called his father and told him what had happened. His father had never seen anyone act like that in the area before. The next day, an uncle visited the cabin, but found no trace of the strange man. And to this day, they have never discovered his identity or his motive why he did what he did. The Strange Man in the Snow. Last winter, I went to a small cabin owned by my uncle in Mountain Valley. I finally reached the cabin after a long 3-hour drive, the tires crunching on the frozen ground. Stepping out of the car, the cold bit through my coat. Almost immediately, A boy around 15 or 16 years old ran out of the cabin. He was young and smiling. His eyes looked tired, as though he hadn't slept in days. He took my luggage and guided me inside. I stepped inside the cabin. It was simple and rustic. A fireplace stood in the corner, with wood neatly stacked beside it. The boy explained how cold it got at night, his voice unusually calm. I told the boy I would go skiing and asked if he could prepare dinner for me while I was out. He nodded with that strange smile. I dressed in my ski gear, excited to hit the slopes. I began skiing through the forest, where all the trees were bare. Halfway down, snow started falling, thick and fast. I took a break and walked toward a large tree. Suddenly, a faint growl echoed in the air. I froze. Standing next to the tree was a man looking up at the sky, his face covered in falling snowflakes. His neck was unnaturally long, and his shoulders jutted out at odd angles. He didn't move at all. This man was unsettling. I quietly stepped back, avoiding sudden movements so as not to disturb him. I just wanted to get back to the cabin. I stepped cautiously, but accidentally crushed a twig underfoot. A loud snap broke the silence. The man looked down, his eyes glowing like those of a wild animal. Blood was smeared across his mouth, and his right hand clutched a dead rabbit, its belly torn open. The man wiped his mouth with his other hand and smiled wickedly. Panicked and frantic, I bolted through the forest, snow crunching under my boots. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if he was following. I burst through the cabin door, slamming it shut behind me. I quickly locked it. The teenager noticed something was wrong. He came out of the kitchen, and I shouted to call the police immediately. He calmly replied, "There's no service here, sir." I checked my phone, and he was right. There was no signal. "What's going on, sir?" the boy asked. I realized I couldn't tell the boy the truth about the man. I didn't want to scare him. So, I lied and said I had heard wild animals in the forest. After a while, I calmed down, embarrassed by my overreaction. Perhaps I had exaggerated it too much. While having dinner, the lights suddenly went out. A heavy snowstorm had started outside, and I could hear the windows rattling from the fierce wind. I wondered where the boy was and realized I never knew his name. Suddenly, I heard footsteps crunching on the snow outside. I slowly turned my head toward the large window. Near the fireplace, the light illuminated a bloodied hand pressed against the outside of the living room window. His bloodied hand was pressed against the glass. It was the man I had seen in the forest. His face was pressed against it, smearing blood across the surface as he grinned, staring directly at me. The man's mouth gaped open, his tongue licking blood around his lips. His unblinking eyes were fixed on me. Then the boy walked in, as if he had been hiding, and looked at the man through the glass. He wasn't scared, he was almost amused. His smile mirrored the man's grin. "That's my father," he said. I froze for a moment, then grabbed the car keys off the wall. I flung open the front door and ran barefoot into the storm. I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from the cabin. The boy's laughter followed me into the night. I hurried to the car, driving for 2 hours, barely able to see through the snowstorm. I didn't stop until I reached the next hotel. Once I was safe, I called my uncle. His answer sent chills down my spine. "What boy? There's no caretaker at the cabin. No one else is supposed to be there." Horrified, I realized I had spent hours in that cabin with complete strangers. The next morning, I reported it to the police. They went with me to the cabin. It was empty. My belongings were gone, and the cabin was spotless, as if no one had ever been there. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what those people wanted, but I would never stay in an isolated cabin again. Betrayal in the dark. It was a quiet night in late October, and I was patrolling the empty streets of our small Texas town. The air carried a heavy, ominous stillness that often lingers in the early hours. Not much happens in our town after midnight. Occasionally, a bar fight or a stray animal wandering the streets. But that night, around 2:15 a.m., the radio crackled. I received a call. I picked up the radio, and there was a man on the other end. "Officer, please. I think there's someone in my house." I could hear his breathing, rapid and shallow. Then, just as he was about to say something, the line cut off. I tried calling him back, but the call went straight to voicemail. I contacted my colleague to trace the location. I stopped, squinting at the GPS. It was a location just a few streets away, near the edge of town. Something about his voice unsettled me, so I decided to check it out. I arrived at the address, but there was nothing there, just an empty lot. The wind whistled softly, brushing through tall, dry grass. I checked the GPS again. The location was correct, but there was no house, just emptiness. In the distance, a faint light flickered on the porch of a farmhouse. I felt an inexplicable pull. I decided to walk to the farmhouse, thinking perhaps they might know something. I parked and approached the door. I knocked, and after a few moments, the door creaked open. A young man answered. He looked tired, confused, and not at all like someone who had made a desperate phone call. "Can I help you, officer?" he asked, squinting at me through the dim light. I explained the call and asked if he had seen or heard anything unusual. He shook his head. I asked if he knew of anyone else living nearby. The man shook his head slowly. "No, sir. There aren't any houses for miles." I thanked him and returned to my car, the unease in my chest growing stronger. I checked the radio again and tried calling the number once more, but it still went straight to voicemail. I decided to head back to the station, but as I turned the key in the ignition, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. There was someone sitting in the back seat. I could only make out a shadow, a hunched figure barely visible in the darkness. My heart pounded as I tried to stay calm, reaching for the radio to call for backup. But before I could, I felt a sharp blow to the back of my head, pain exploding as everything went dark. I woke up dazed, my head throbbing. My hands were tied, and the room smelled of damp wood and rust. A single bulb swung overhead, casting long, jagged shadows. And then I saw him. It was my colleague, Jeff. His face twisted into a maniacal grin, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You didn't expect to see me, did you?" he sneered. "I've been waiting for this," he continued, pacing with a gleaming knife in his hand. "Do you know how long I've had to smile through your success, Brad? While I was stuck with scraps?" He lunged, pressing the knife close to my face. He started taunting me about how I was always calm and how he'd see how calm I'd remain now. The cuts weren't deep, but they stung. Blood trickled down my skin as he mocked me, savoring every moment. I waited, biding my time. His grip on the knife loosened as he got lost in his rage. When he leaned too close, I acted. I kicked his shin with all my strength, making him stumble. My hands were still tied, but I used my shoulder to charge at him, slamming him into the wall. The knife fell to the floor. He was stunned, giving me just enough time to grab the knife with my bound hands. I bolted out of there. Behind me, Jeff staggered out, shouting my name, but his voice faded as I ran toward my patrol car. I stumbled into the police station, bloody but alive. My colleagues rushed to me, their faces a mix of shock and concern. I told them everything. Jeff was arrested. He sat calmly, as if nothing had happened, but his eyes gleamed with malice. Weeks later, I drove past the place where it all began, but now I understood better. Sometimes, the monsters we fear don't hide in the shadows. They stand right next to us, wearing friendly faces. The obsession with the forgotten hospital. My girlfriend and I are passionate about road trips, but things wouldn't have taken a turn for the worse if our passion had stayed within its limits. On a rainy day, Stella and I were on our way back from a road trip. The rain grew heavier, and driving became challenging amidst the storm, so we decided to pull over on the highway shoulder. I worried that waiting on the highway during a storm wasn't a safe choice. I was pondering what to do next when Stella said,
Look, Mark.
"There's a building at the left, turn up ahead." I followed her gaze and saw a structure peeking out from behind the trees at some distance. Stella said,
Let's go there. We might find shelter for the night.
At the time, it seemed like a good idea. I realized it was an abandoned hospital. We got out of the car and ran inside. The large glass door at the entrance was shattered. As we stepped into the hospital, I realized no one had been here in ages. Furniture was broken, and shards of glass were scattered everywhere. Rain seeped through the damp ceiling and dripped onto the floor. The sound of water droplets mixed with the creak of rust. The wind howled through broken windows, creating an eerie atmosphere. Stella whispered, "This feels like an adventure." Stella was a horror writer, so an eerie setting like this excited her. We'd explored many abandoned places for her creative inspiration. I chuckled and said, "Let's look around. Who knows, you might find a story here." If I'd known my joke would turn into a nightmare, I would have left right then. Stella and I began exploring the place, turning on our phone flashlights. To the left was a hallway lined with several rooms. We entered the hallway and opened the first room. Inside was an old, dirty bed. Near the bed were a table and a chair. What caught my attention was the safety straps attached to the bed handles. I'd never seen hospital beds this strange before. Most of the rooms were like this. After a while, Stella grew bored and said there was nothing to see here and suggested going upstairs. We climbed the stairs, cobwebs and dust everywhere. The hallway upstairs was littered with broken glass and damp clothes scattered everywhere. When I shone my flashlight on the walls, I saw disturbing drawings, demonic faces etched onto the walls. Someone had even written, "You will not escape." I felt uneasy seeing all this and told Stella, maybe we should wait in the car. The rain will stop eventually. Stella teased and mocked me. At the end of the hallway, there was a large door with the words "Surgery Department" on it. Stella was looking at the graffiti on the wall. I asked her, "What do you think happened here?" Stella smiled and said it was just a surgery room. I pushed the door open with annoyance, and with a terrible creaking sound, it opened. I've never seen such a strange operating table before. It looked more like a stretcher, but it had handcuffs and leather straps. Stella's face went pale as she examined all of it with a genuinely terrified expression. I approached the operating table. There were surgical tools lying on it. These tools looked quite different. Scalpels resembled small saws, and there was also a drill. I picked it up and examined it. I told Stella and wondered aloud what this tool was used for. Stella looked at it with frightened eyes and said she didn't think this was a normal hospital. She explained it used to be an asylum. That's why there were leather straps and handcuffs on all the beds in the rooms. Before I could process it, my eyes were drawn to the tip of the drill in my hand. Something dark was dried and speckled on its edge. I shone the light on it and was horrified to realize it looked like dried blood. There was something like a freezer. Stella rushed over and opened it. She started screaming. A horrifying sight lay before us. Inside were numerous jars, emitting a foul stench. They contained ears, noses, and other unidentifiable parts. We couldn't believe our eyes that patients were treated in such grotesque ways. Then I saw one jar. It resembled a model of a human head with its eyes closed. But what happened next still chills me to this day. As we stared at it, it suddenly opened its eyes. We stumbled back, terrified, and began running for our lives. When I looked back, I saw a dark figure chasing us. Sprinting forward, we could hear the screams of hundreds of voices emanating from the asylum, crying out in agony. Stella and I bolted out of the asylum and jumped into the car. Without a second thought, I slammed the gas pedal so hard the car screeched. Somehow, we were lucky to have survived. Stella later researched the abandoned asylum. She discovered that it once housed insane criminals and intellectually disabled individuals, but the doctors running it would often torture them and conduct inhumane experiments on them. After a series of protests, the asylum was shut down, and all records were erased. Locals feared the place, even during the day. They believed the countless souls of the tormented patients still haunted the site. Nightmare with the delivery person. I am one of those people who hates ordering food over the phone. My kids always criticize me and call me old-fashioned because rain, thunder, or snow, whenever we order food, I always drive straight to the restaurant. What they don't know is that this isn't just a whim. It's a story that's not exactly a pleasant one. I was 12 years old, and it was one of the first times I was allowed to stay home alone. My parents had gone to a friend's party a few blocks away and decided I was old enough to take care of myself. I was thrilled because I could stay home alone and sleep whenever I wanted. That night, I was allowed to order a pizza by myself. At first, my parents waited for the delivery guy, but he was taking too long, so they had to leave. Seeing how excited I was, they left me some money and headed out. As soon as they left, I turned on the TV and cranked up the volume. I knew it would be a long night, so I took the dog out to the backyard. After my parents left, he finally arrived, very late. I heard the sound of a motorcycle stopping outside my house. I stood up and walked toward the door. Maybe the pizza guy had finally arrived. I opened the door and saw a tall, skinny man with a scruffy, bushy beard holding a pizza box. He looked at me with a strange, almost unsettling expression. At that moment, I was hungry and feeling a little uneasy, so I said,
You're late.
The man stared at me and said,
Hey kid, what's your problem?
I started to feel weird about his behavior. He seemed almost angry, and his body language became more aggressive. At that moment, I got scared and just wanted to avoid anything bad happening. I quickly handed him the money and grabbed the pizza box from his hands. I apologized and quickly closed the door. I was so scared I nearly slammed it shut. But it didn't stop there. Things got worse. He didn't leave but stood there, almost shouting through the front door.
Hey kid, what are you doing? I haven't even counted the money.
All the money is there.
I cried and apologized. At that point, I just begged him to leave and take all the money. There was silence for a moment, but then the man started yelling again, demanding a tip. He lost control, banging on the door with his fists and kicking it when I didn't respond. After a few seconds, just as suddenly as it started, he seemed to get bored and left. My first instinct was to slowly creep toward the door and peek out the nearby window to check if he was really gone. But as I did so, his face suddenly appeared right in front of me, twisted into a crooked smile, and in his hand, he was holding something. When I realized he was holding a baseball bat, I panicked, frantically hiding under the bed, hoping he wouldn't find me. Meanwhile, he pounded on the door with the baseball bat, and after a few strikes at the lock, the door burst open and he entered my house. He went straight to the wardrobe, where I almost hid, and began smashing it violently. If I had hidden there, my entire body would have been destroyed. He left the room and headed straight for the backyard, suspecting I might escape there. My dog immediately attacked him, but at that moment, I heard my dog whimper. I realized something had happened to him, and I couldn't hold back the overwhelming sadness. He moved like a shadow, storming toward where I was hiding, his face twisted in anger.
Where are you, kid? I know you're hiding somewhere.
He yanked the mattress away and began smashing the bed with the bat, as if trying to break the wood and leave me trapped beneath the wreckage. The wood of the bed began to splinter, and the shards dug into my skin. All I could do was scream for help. As if answering my prayers, two of my neighbors burst in from behind and tackled him to the floor. He quickly got back up, grabbing the bat and trying to swing at them, but one of the neighbors managed to wrestle it away. Then he fled immediately. Suddenly, everything went white and I passed out. When I woke up, I found myself in the hospital. My parents were crying in front of me, saying I was lucky to have only minor injuries. I accidentally overheard my parents talking about the man. He had been a convict with a history of violence, and that night, he had fought with a couple and argued with his boss. In the years that followed, I never ordered delivery again after what happened. Escape your pursuer at Dunkin' Donuts. Isa worked the night shift at her uncle's Dunkin' Donuts, a small, quiet spot off a lonely highway, struggling with boredom as a violent storm raged outside. Her phone battery died, flickering before finally shutting off. With a sigh, she plugged it into the charger. The empty Dunkin' Donuts felt eerily quiet. Feeling sleepiness creeping in from the stillness of the night shift, Isa got up and headed to the back to make herself a cup of coffee. Trying to stay alert, Isa sat at the corner table, sipping her coffee. The sound of the storm seemed to press in from all directions, making her feel unusually uneasy in the empty store. Just as she took another sip, the power went out, plunging the store into darkness. The bell above the door rang, signaling someone had entered. Isa froze. She wasn't expecting anyone, especially during this storm. Blinking, she slowly moved toward the counter, the only light coming from a nearby candle. As Isa lifted the candle, the pale face of a woman emerged from the shadows. Her hair was disheveled, her pants torn in multiple places, and her shirt dotted with what looked like dried blood. Isa, horrified, exclaimed,
Oh my God, you scared me. What happened to you? Are you okay?
The woman's eyes were wide with fear, an expression haunted and desperate.
Please,
She gasped.
you have to help me. He's coming. If we don't move fast, he'll kill me.
Before Isa could respond, headlights swept across the window. A blue pickup truck pulled into the parking lot. The woman grabbed Isa's arm with surprising strength for someone so frail.
We need to hide. Now.
Isa led her to the storage room and locked the door. Chaos ensued as the front door of the store opened again, this time revealing a man in his 40s with cold, sharp eyes. Isa forced a smile, trying to stay calm and keep him from suspecting anything.
Good evening. Can I get you something?
The man didn't answer immediately, his eyes darting toward the back room, where the door was slightly ajar.
I'm looking for someone. A woman. She came in here, didn't she?
Isa shook her head and said it was just her there. Isa was on high alert. The man kept his hand fidgeting in his jacket pocket, as if ready to pull something out at any moment. He seemed unconvinced and stepped closer to the counter, his cold, calculating eyes fixed on her.
Are you sure?
Things felt wrong. Before Isa could respond, the backroom door burst open. The woman dashed out, holding a fire extinguisher.
Run!
She shouted as she sprayed water into his face, then unleashed a torrent of foam, forcing the man to stagger back, momentarily blinded. They grabbed a baseball bat from behind the counter and bolted out the back door into the raging storm, disappearing into the pitch-black night. Freezing, they ran toward the woods. The man wasn't far behind, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, as he shouted threats. Finally, they found an abandoned wooden cabin, dilapidated and isolated, its door hanging loosely on its hinges. They immediately began barricading the door with an old table.
What now?
Isa whispered. The woman pulled out a small knife from her pocket and told Isa that, if necessary, they would face him. She had been running from him for weeks and decided it was time to stop hiding. He arrived and began pounding on the door, trying to force his way in. Isa and the woman exchanged a look, bracing for whatever would happen next. He burst through the door. The woman charged at him, knocking him off balance. Isa, trembling but determined, swung the baseball bat hard at his head. He collapsed to the floor, dazed. The woman quickly grabbed a rope from the cabin and tied the man up while Isa used his phone to call the police. When the police arrived, they uncovered horrifying evidence in his truck, tools for murder and belongings from previous victims, women he had kidnapped and tortured. As the storm began to dissipate, it was finally over. They turned to each other and smiled. The Hitchhiker's Trap. This happened in the winter of 1993, when Keely was 20 years old. It was 1:30 May, when Keely finished her shift at the factory and stopped at a gas station to fill up her smoking car. The gas station was nearly empty, except for a few cars parked in the distance. While Keely was pumping gas, a woman began approaching. She appeared to be around Keely's age, approaching with a frightened, distressed, and anxious look. The woman spoke hurriedly, out of breath. She said she had argued with her boyfriend and needed to use a payphone to call a friend for a ride. Keely listened, but her unease grew as the woman explained that she had been harassed and feared the men in a light green car parked next to the gas station's dumpster. Initially hesitant, Keely noted that the woman was dressed neatly and wasn't drunk or anything similar. She just seemed genuinely anxious and scared. So, after finishing her refueling, Keely told her to get in the car. As they drove down a dark, quiet street, Keely asked where the woman lived. The woman kept glancing into the rearview mirror, fidgeting in her seat. She didn't answer Keely's question, just mumbled something incomprehensible. Then she asked Keely to take her to a house not far away on the edge of town. When they arrived, it looked unusual, almost abandoned. Keely asked skeptically, "You live here?" She simply told Keely the house was under renovation and asked her to wait outside for a moment. Keely reluctantly got out of the car and leaned on the hood. She called back, asking Keely to help her. Still trying to make sense of everything, Keely reluctantly agreed and approached the porch. However, as Keely neared the house, a sense of hesitation crept over her. Something about this house, and the woman felt off. Just as she reached out to touch the doorknob, a loud bang erupted behind her. Time seemed to freeze, and she felt a sharp pain at the back of her head. Everything spun as the pain surged, and the next thing she knew, she was collapsing onto the ground in front of the porch. Keely's vision blurred, but she could still see the woman standing over her with a smug smile. "Thanks for the help," she said, as darkness consumed Keely, punctuated by her chilling laughter. When Keely woke up, her wrists and ankles were tightly bound with rope. Her head throbbed with pain as she lay on the floor of a dark, filthy room reeking of mildew. Keely didn't dare move, but observed what was happening. The woman sat on a chair not far away, holding up her phone on a video call. "You should mind your own business," she said, not even glancing at Keely. Keely regained her vision and focused on the phone screen. It was a man standing next to a car, the same one she had seen at the gas station. He said he'd pick her up soon to catch more victims. She realized everything from the start had been a trap. Keely struggled against her restraints, her mind racing. She knew she had to act fast. Despite the pain, Keely, being the only woman at the plastic factory, had learned to handle such situations. She relied on her experience to quietly inspect and work on her restraints. Finally, the rope loosened slightly, but the woman began approaching Keely, so she decided to stay still, pretending nothing was amiss. When the woman seemed to sense something, she moved closer to Keely. The moment arrived, Keely sprang up, elbowing her in the face. She turned and kicked the woman hard with her bound feet, causing her to stumble painfully to the ground. That gave Keely the chance to free her legs and run outside. Keely dashed outside and got into her car. As she frantically started the engine, the woman suddenly appeared with a menacing smile. Somehow, she had gotten into Keely's car. "Mind giving me a ride?" Just as the car started, the woman, not wearing her seatbelt, was thrown forward as Keely hit the accelerator. Keely pushed the woman out of the car and drove off, calling the police to have them arrested. When Keely finally got home, she told her sister about the harrowing encounter. While relieved that Keely was safe, her sister scolded her for not going to the police immediately. After a few days of investigation, the police arrested the two criminals. Keely couldn't believe what had happened, but at least she had survived. And she learned a terrifying lesson about the hidden dangers in seemingly harmless situations. The ride on the strange road. I live a straightforward life, and I'm certain that what I saw and heard on New Year's Eve last year wasn't a hallucination or anything like that. It was 100% real. A friend of mine, Darren, had his family host a New Year's Eve party at their house, where all the family's friends were invited. It was in one of those affluent neighborhoods and could only be accessed via rural roads. There were no other houses along the turn, except for a hastily built, solitary house that seemed abandoned for years, occasionally with flickering lights visible. After a few minutes of driving, I saw something ahead among the trees. As I got closer, I could see it was the figure of a person standing alone by the roadside. A woman, clearly dressed in a white dress, was standing completely still, looking out of place in the cold winter weather. Although I briefly considered stopping to help, when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw her slowly turn around, seemingly following me with a cold, eerie gaze. When I arrived at Darren's house, I pushed the unsettling experience out of my mind and enjoyed the party. After ringing in the new year, I stayed a bit longer to help clean up, as I was one of Darren's close family friends. As I left and started my car, I noticed the low tire pressure light was on. My car was an older model, so it didn't specify which tire. I remembered this often happened when the weather turned cold, so I didn't think much of it. I could take an alternate route home to avoid the road where I saw the woman, but it would add about 20 minutes. I decided to tough it out and take the old route. I truly wish I hadn't, even for just a few seconds. Something was off with the tires. I could hear it too, a sound like metal scraping against the road. Foolishly, I got out of the car. The headlights automatically turned off, plunging me into the deep darkness of the surrounding forest. Using my phone flashlight, I inspected each tire and found one mysteriously torn to shreds. Stranded in an area with no cell signal, everything grew eerily silent. Suddenly, I heard the chilling voice of a woman saying,
"I see you."
Then I aimed my flashlight straight ahead again. Standing at the edge of the trees was the woman in the white dress. This time, her features were clear. Her dress was stained with mud, her frame was gaunt and pale, and her tangled hair hung down to her elbows. I sprinted toward Darren's house, hearing the sound of snapping branches and rustling leaves behind me. She was chasing me, but I managed to lose her quickly. I finally made it to Darren's house. I banged on the door, pleading for them to open it. I explained what had happened. They offered to let me stay overnight while they called the police and arranged for a tow truck. But I soon realized it wasn't over. I woke up to the sound of knocking at 3 a.m. Of course, none of the windows in the room had curtains. I didn't dare look outside until I heard a deep, raspy voice. I sat frozen on the bed, listening to the sound of stones hitting the window. The voice of that woman echoed from the darkness.
I see you.
Admittedly, I might be a coward, but at that moment, all I could do was hide under the blanket and avoid looking outside. I stayed silent until morning. The next morning, Darren's father found a large, rusty knife that didn't belong to the family, likely the one the woman had used to slash my tires. But this also meant she had followed my car to the party. After they called the police, I gave my statement. I suggested they check the cabin along the road because I had a feeling that the woman was connected to it. Eventually, they investigated and updated me, saying they didn't find anyone living there, but there were many dried animal carcasses scattered throughout the surrounding forest. The woman I saw was never found, which of course raises many questions. But the most terrifying thing to me is how she was able to track me so quickly. I started this year's journey determined not to let fear dictate my actions. The events of last New Year's Eve haunted me every day, but I was tired of running from the darkness. I convinced myself that she was merely a ghost, and the other events were just eerily perfect coincidences. But this time, I decided to take a detour, a different route to Darren's party, and it was much farther than the one I had taken before. Something felt off. The GPS signal cut out midway, and the road I was on seemed unfamiliar. I wasn't too familiar with the area, so I followed the path I remembered most vividly. And then, as if by fate, the winding road curved, and I found myself facing it. That house by the roadside, it still bore the taped-off markings from when the police had been there. I parked the car, engine still running, and sat for a moment, staring at it. A chill ran down my spine, but I slowly stepped out of the car. Gathering all my courage, I stepped onto the porch. The wooden steps creaked under my weight. I knocked once. Nothing. Then I slowly pushed the door open. The wooden house looked even more dilapidated, with parts of the roof sagging, rotting beams, rickety furniture, a few broken chairs, and a fireplace stuffed with what looked like bones. I stepped closer, and that's when I heard it, almost like a whisper, unmistakable.
Come closer.
It sent shivers down my spine. Then, I turned on my phone's flashlight. Another horrifying sight revealed itself before me. I saw the walls. They were covered in crude drawings, scratched into the surface, as if by something sharp, along with claw marks that looked agonizing. Names were scrawled beneath each face. The horrifying part was seeing one that matched my own. When the light stopped at a wooden table in the middle of the room, I saw a sharp knife, a few jars filled with dark red liquid, and even animal teeth. I started to wonder, could someone have moved in here? Could it belong to a hunter? I didn't think these things had been here for long, as the police had said the house was completely empty when they searched it.
You're braver than I thought.
A voice emerged from the darkness. I spun around. She stood at the far end of the room, tall, pale, and gaunt. Her white dress was smeared with mud and streaks of red, her deranged eyes staring right at me. She lunged at me with terrifying speed. In her hand, she held a knife, and it was aimed straight at me. I instinctively grabbed the knife on the table nearby to defend myself. I swung it, but she dodged and shoved me to the ground. We struggled, our heavy breaths and screams echoing in the cramped space. She laughed maniacally, her nails clawing into my skin. Everything happened so fast, filled with panic. I fought back, using all my strength to shove her off. I reached for the knife that had fallen to the ground, grabbed it, and stabbed her in the shoulder. Her scream pierced the air. She screamed but didn't stop. Her eyes burned with madness.
You won't escape, Drake.
Charging at me again. I grabbed a jar from the same table and smashed it over her head. This time, she staggered, visibly dazed, and slowly collapsed. Without hesitation, I ran out of there and barricaded the door with a wooden plank nearby, hoping it would hold her off for a while. I got into my car and immediately called the police. I didn't stop until I reached Darren's house, trembling and covered in blood. The police arrived shortly after my call. They didn't find her in the house, but this time she couldn't escape. The trail of blood from her wounds led into the forest. In their report, they said she was a deranged individual who had been stalking people traveling this deserted route, including me. She had set up horrifying traps to play with me. It turned out that all along, I had mistaken her for a ghost conjured by my paranoia or something far more sinister that I couldn't comprehend. The final trip. Christy was an Uber driver. She enjoyed the flexibility it offered her, but she was also aware of the risks. Many people warned her that Uber might not be a safe job for a woman. She had never been scared and didn't believe such situations were real. But when you're the mother of 3 kids and struggling to give them a good life, you take risks. One night, Christy experienced a harrowing situation that proved all the warnings she had received were true. That night, at 10:30 p.m., Christy accepted a ride request from a quiet suburban neighborhood. The passenger was a man named Calvin. When Christy arrived, she saw him wearing a hoodie, avoiding eye contact. Something about his demeanor made her uneasy, but she reminded herself to stay calm and professional. That was her first big mistake. Calvin got into the car with hardly any reaction, pulling his hood down to hide his face. Many passengers did this when uncomfortable with her filming the trip, but it was also something that made her feel safer. Calvin said nothing and stared out the window, making Christy feel uneasy. She tried not to dwell on it and focused on the road, but her discomfort grew. Just minutes away from the destination, the increasingly deserted road made her fear. Her worst nightmare was coming true. Suddenly, Calvin leaned forward and pressed something hard and cold against her neck. It was a gun. He growled, "Turn left at the next exit, and don't ask any questions." She trembled, begging him not to hurt her because she had kids at home who depended on her. But he pressed the gun harder against her. The car stopped in an isolated clearing. Calvin ordered Christy out. He turned off her phone and took the car keys. Desperation filled her as her mind raced to find a way to escape. They moved deeper into the woods. Calvin shoved her forward, the gun still pressed against her back. Reaching a clearing, he rummaged through her belongings for anything of value. He found a small amount of cash, but grumbled that it wasn't enough before continuing to search. Christy realized this was her moment to act. She pulled a can of pepper spray from her pocket and quickly sprayed it into his face. He screamed in pain, and Christy seized the opportunity to escape, running as fast as she could. Panic fueled her speed. The place was pitch dark, and Christy ran blindly, each step bringing her closer to either freedom or death. Branches scratched and cut her skin as she ran, but none of that mattered now. She just wanted to survive. Ahead, Christy spotted a light in the distance, a potential way out of the forest. As she ran, she could hear Calvin's footsteps getting closer, and her hope of escape began to fade. Another mistake happened. Christy, distracted by looking back at him chasing her, tripped over a hidden rock and fell to the ground. Pain shot through her ankle. As she tried to get up, he grabbed her by the hair and yanked it. She begged, "Please don't kill me. I gave you everything I had." In response, he threw her against a nearby tree. In pain and despair, she obeyed him, kneeling and begging for her life. Christy was waiting for something to happen, for someone to save her, but perhaps this was her chance to save herself. While he was catching his breath from running and rubbing his eyes in pain, Christy quietly reached behind her and grabbed a rock. Without thinking much, she struck him on the head with the rock. Blood streamed down his face as he staggered. Despite her twisted ankle, she ran toward the light she had seen earlier. A narrow stream, quietly flowing through the forest, caused her to pause for a moment. Thinking of her children, she waded through the stream, knowing the sound of the water would mask her footsteps and hide her movements. The pain in her ankle was nothing compared to the horror of what would happen if Calvin caught her. She crawled through the bushes, her body aching, but her will to survive stronger than ever. When she reached the road, her body was exhausted, but she could hear the faint sound of an approaching car. Christy staggered toward the roadside, frantically waving her arms, barely able to speak. "Please, I need help. He's chasing me. Please." A woman immediately stopped her car and ran to Christy, calling the police. And that was when Christy's vision blurred as she collapsed from exhaustion. Christy, now safe, was able to assist the authorities in building a case against him, leading to his arrest and prosecution. Despite her injuries, Christy found peace and gratitude in knowing she had survived. She could see her children again. She had conquered her fear and emerged stronger. The house in the woods of the stranger. Mai's family loved traveling whenever there were holidays. They often went on short trips, and back then, Mai was probably only 10 years old. Mai's father rented a small house in the woods, in a farm-like area with scattered small houses. It was a quiet tourist spot, mostly visited by campers and hikers. At that time, they were the only tenants staying on the property, or at least, that's what the landlord told Mai's family. The fresh air, the tranquility of the lake, and the chirping of birds made her love the place. Mai's father took her out on a boat to the middle of the lake to fish. It was her first time, and she was thrilled. Suddenly, Mai noticed a large tree to the left and felt as if someone, a shadowy figure, was standing under the tree watching them. "Dad, who is that?" she asked her father and pointed in that direction, but the figure disappeared as soon as Mai pointed it out. Her father dismissed her worries, and they returned to the house for lunch. Back from the lake, Mai's mother set up a small table and chairs for snacks while preparing for dinner. After the meal, Mai thought about wandering off to play and explore a bit. Her mother called out, reminding her not to go too far. Mai started walking around, but suddenly she saw a rabbit hopping about. Excited, she began following it. The rabbit hopped into a nearby bush, and she ran over and started searching through the bush. Suddenly, she heard rustling footsteps behind her. Thinking it was the rabbit, she turned around. Mai turned around and saw a man standing there with a strange smile. He was holding the rabbit she had just seen. His smile was creepy, but Mai, in her innocence, didn't think much of it. He raised an eyebrow at her and said, "Looking for this rabbit, little girl? Do you want to pet it?" Mai innocently told him, "But my mom says they always run away. They won't run if you put them in a cage." He scratched his head and said he didn't have a cage, but mentioned he had one at his house. Then, he suggested Mai come with him. Mai knew it was a big warning sign, but at 10 years old, all she could think about was the rabbit. So, she agreed to go with the man. The man's eyes lit up. He led Mai through the woods, and after a short walk, they arrived at another house that looked exactly like the one her family was staying in. Mai felt a bit surprised. Inside, the dim, shadowy light revealed a filthy and cluttered house. with old, muddy clothes scattered across the floor. She began to smell an intensely unpleasant stench. Mai held the rabbit in her arms while he went into another room. After a moment, he called out, asking if she could come and help him. Mai stood up and stepped into the room, where the stench grew even stronger. The room was very dark, with a dirty, tattered piece of cloth hanging over the window. Small beams of sunlight filtered through the tiny holes, barely lighting the room. It took her a moment to realize there was a bed in the room, and lying on it appeared to be a woman. In the dim light, she could make out a skeletal hand, covered in horrifying sores. Mai began to feel that something was very wrong. She stepped back and said, "I need to go back. My mom is waiting for me." The situation had become alarming, and she realized she needed to leave. The man's face twisted into a displeased frown. Before she could move, he lunged forward, grabbed her, and lifted her off the ground. He muttered something strange. "Touch this little one, darling. It might cure your illness." Mai struggled and screamed for help, but he held her tightly, dragging her closer to the figure on the bed. The stench grew more overwhelming. Just as he was about to force her closer to the woman, Mai kicked him in the face and grabbed the curtain, pulling it down. He fell to the floor, clutching his bleeding nose. Mai also fell, and the entire curtain came down, flooding the room with sunlight. For the first time, Mi saw the woman clearly. Her peeling skin resembled that of a corpse. The decaying body lunged toward Mi, bony hands reaching out to grab her. She screamed and backed away like prey before a predator. Suddenly, Mi's father burst into the room, shouting her name. He rushed to her, lifted her off the floor, and carried her out of the cabin as quickly as he could. The woman's skeletal hands clawed at the air. Mai was carried out of the house, fainting in the process. The story that unfolded afterward shocked everyone. The man and the woman were escaped criminals who had fled into the woods to hide. The woman was severely infected due to poisoning. She claimed to know magic, and they believed that using an innocent child could heal her, transferring her illness to another body. When medics took the woman to the hospital, she died within a week. The man was arrested for attempted kidnapping and returned to prison, where he faced additional charges. Mai still cannot shake the image of that sickly woman crawling toward her. She no longer wants to travel to the woods or stay in cabins. Thankfully, her father arrived just in time. Escape from the terrifying snowstorm night. This happened a few New Year's Eves ago. I was driving to my parents' house to celebrate the new year with them. A simple trip. I was used to long drives. Snow started falling about an hour into the drive. Light at first, but it kept coming until I found myself in the middle of a snowstorm. The highway grew slippery, and visibility dropped to near zero. My car, a small one, wasn't built for driving in the snow. The tires slid even on the smallest incline, and I realized I needed to stop. I texted my parents about my situation to reassure them, but honestly, I wasn't so sure myself. An hour passed, and the snow only got worse. I began worrying about running out of gas or draining the battery by keeping the heater on too long. I kept the engine running, hoping the storm would ease. The wind howled outside. I began to feel the weight of isolation when I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw headlights cutting through the storm behind me. I felt an overwhelming relief as a snowplow stopped beside me. Finally, someone had come to help. The truck slowed and stopped beside me. It was the driver, a man leaning out the window. He was an older man, perhaps in his late 50s, wearing a thick coat and a black knit cap pulled down over his ears. I expected him to say something, but he just stared at me for an uncomfortably long moment. His voice was hoarse, like someone who had smoked for years.
Are you okay?
He asked. I told him I didn't think my car could handle the conditions, and he said to get in, that he'd take me somewhere safe. He got out of the truck. I hesitated. I didn't know this man, and he seemed a little strange, but he appeared sincere. The storm was relentless, and staying wasn't an option. "All right," I replied, then asked if he could take me to my destination. He didn't answer right away, his eyes darting quickly behind my car, as if looking for something. Then, without a word, he told me to get in. The warmth inside the snowplow was a relief compared to the biting cold outside. We didn't talk much during the ride, but as the minutes passed, I began to sense something strange. As I glanced out the window, I realized we weren't heading toward my parents' house. The surroundings looked unfamiliar. A lingering unease crept in. I asked, trying to sound casual, "Are we going the right way?" The driver didn't look at me and said it was a shortcut. At least GPS showed we were going the right way, so I figured I was just being paranoid. I glanced around the truck. Everything was a mess. Empty whiskey bottles and torn maps stuffed into the side compartments. My eyes stopped at something wedged between the seats. A knife, half hidden under the chair. Suddenly, I saw a small house ahead, the only house I'd seen after a long stretch of emptiness. I knew I had to act before something bad happened. A sense of foreboding washed over me. I waited until we got closer, took a deep breath, grabbed the door handle, and kicked the door open as hard as I could. I flung the door wide and ran into the snowstorm. The blizzard made visibility almost zero. The thick snow slowed my steps, but I pressed on toward the faint light of the wooden house. Behind me, I could hear him shouting, but I didn't stop. The snowplow driver didn't give up. He rummaged through the glove compartment and pulled out a handgun, yelling,
Get back here! You're not going anywhere!
As I neared the house's door, he fired the gun. I thought I'd used up all my luck when the bullet grazed my shoulder, leaving a painful wound. Staggering, I banged on the wooden door, shouting for help. A man appeared with a shotgun in hand. Before I could explain, he seemed to understand and quickly pulled me inside, slamming the door shut. He stayed outside, shouting, his eyes wild and unrelenting. He fired the gun again, the bullet shattering a large piece of the window. The hunter, with no other choice, opened the door and charged outside with the shotgun. The two of them wrestled in the blizzard, the gun falling from their hands. I couldn't just stand there. Before he could act, I picked up the shotgun and aimed it straight at him. As he hesitated, the hunter took the opportunity to tackle him to the snow-covered ground and tied him up with a rope. A short while later, the police arrived, and he was arrested. I was so grateful to the hunter for saving me, and relieved I had made the right decision to jump out of that truck. The truck driver's nightmare chase. I'm Alan, and I want to tell you about my job. The only job I've ever had, and definitely one of the most dangerous. I'm a truck driver, often driving for hours, almost always sleep-deprived and in a rush, and worse, in the dark. Aside from the fear of crashing or falling asleep at the wheel, people always ask me if I have any stories to tell. That night, I was driving with my companion, Randy. Randy had recently gone through a divorce and didn't have kids, so he didn't have much going on. He'd had a few drinks that day and was a bit tipsy. As I looked out the window, I saw a lot of police cars speeding past me. They seemed in a hurry, as if searching for someone. I didn't think much of it and kept driving. After a while, I decided to stop so Randy could use the bathroom and we could take a break. I waited, but after a few minutes, my unease grew as Randy didn't return. Worried, I grabbed a flashlight and headed into the woods. "Hey buddy, you out there?" Randy didn't answer. I didn't think he could be drunk enough to pass out, so I kept following the trail into the woods. I moved through the bushes, calling Randy's name. Suddenly, I heard a voice, a strange tapping sound coming from behind a large tree. Cautiously, I moved closer, thinking Randy might be playing a prank. I approached and saw a girl leaning against a tree, covered in blood and trembling in fear. I rushed to help her, but then I saw a knife in her hand and stepped back. "Hey, what happened to you? Are you hurt? Do you need help?" The girl stood up without answering. Instead, she began moving toward me, her eyes wide with something I couldn't identify. I raised my hands, trying to stay calm, but she didn't stop. I noticed her legs were covered in blood, but there was something off about her posture. Amidst the chaos, I heard a noise and turned around. What shocked me more was my friend Randy. He was in danger. Randy was sitting under a tree not far away, pale and injured, with blood streaming from his side. He was alive but weak. "I'll save you," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite my panic. But before I could act, she lunged at Randy with a ravenous look in her eyes. Without thinking, I screamed to draw her attention, luring her away from Randy. She turned to look at me, grinning eerily.
It's hunting time.
I sprinted through the trees, dodging sharp branches like claws. She chased close behind, her pounding footsteps echoing in my ears, making my heart feel like it would burst. While running, I tripped over a rock, tumbling to the ground. She lunged at me, and I had to wrestle with her, holding back her wild fury for a moment. She seemed intent on devouring me. My breath caught as her hand slipped, stabbing the knife into the ground just inches from where it could have ended me. I shoved her off me, grabbed a large branch and swung it hard, striking her. Her pained scream echoed through the forest as the knife fell from her hand. Pain blurred my vision, but I knew I couldn't stop. Even injured, she continued chasing me, her breath ragged like a wild beast. Using all my knowledge of the forest, I took a gamble. I changed direction, heading toward where I suspected there was a bear trap. She was still close behind me. Nearing the trap, I slowed down deliberately before suddenly leaping aside. She charged forward, unaware of the trap. Snap! The steel jaws slammed shut with a deafening clang. The woman screamed in agony as her leg was caught in the trap. Without hesitation, I ran back to Randy. He was visibly weaker, but still alive. I quickly used a handkerchief to stop the bleeding from his wound. I helped him into the truck. Every step felt like a battle, but I didn't stop. Finally, I got him into the vehicle and drove away as fast as I could. On the way, I came across a patrolling police car. They quickly arrived and arrested the woman. They said she was an outcast living in the forest, hunting and attacking anyone who wandered into the area. Even her clothing had belonged to previous victims. In her hideout, the police found evidence that she had resorted to cannibalism and many other horrifying items. Randy survived, but the wounds, both physical and emotional, would never fully heal. I couldn't forget that night either, but I told myself that I had done everything to save my friend. And when facing darkness, you must fight to survive. Behind the neighbor's door. It was December, and the neighborhood had started decorating for the holidays. I knew all my neighbors, and they were all very friendly. The neighbors lit up the streets with their festive displays. Paul, our neighbor to the right, was no different. He had put up his lights early, which I found unusual for a single man in his 40s. He seemed kind enough, though a bit lonely. I didn't see him often. He came and went for work, but I always greeted him when we crossed paths. Recently, though, I hadn't seen him at all. His car hadn't moved from the driveway in days. One night, I noticed Paul's house across the street. His Christmas lights were flickering wildly, not the usual twinkling effect. It was erratic, more like a wiring glitch. The flickering lights gave the house an unsettling feeling. At first, I brushed it off, thinking it was just some electrical issue, nothing to worry about. The next morning, I went to work. Paul's car was still in the driveway, and once again, all his curtains were tightly shut. That evening, I went outside and saw everything was exactly the same as the night before. I decided to be kind and let him know, as well as check if he was okay since I hadn't seen him. I walked over, hesitating for a moment before knocking on the door. There was no answer, so I rang the bell. Again, nothing. After the third ring, Paul finally opened the door. Paul greeted me with a forced smile. I told him about his flickering Christmas lights and how I just wanted to make sure everything was okay. I asked if he was okay, since I hadn't seen him in a while. He said he just wasn't feeling well. From the way he spoke, I felt his demeanor was awkward and cold. I noticed when he raised his hand, there were black smudges or soot on it. I glanced down briefly, and he immediately pulled his hand back behind him. Then I heard something from inside the house. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but it sounded like a child's voice. Paul didn't have any kids. I was about to ask if he heard it too, but I decided against it. It sent a chill down my spine. I glanced at Paul, but he didn't seem to notice. The sound seemed to come from deep within his house, distant and muffled. His expression didn't change, but there was a coldness in his eyes. I was about to leave, but something inside me, an indescribable feeling, held me back. Then I decided to go back. He was about to close the door when he seemed surprised to see me return. I awkwardly made an excuse, asking if I could borrow some tools to fix a pipe. He politely and courteously invited me into the house. While Paul was rummaging through things in the living room, I asked if I could use the bathroom. On the way, I noticed something strange, a bookshelf in an almost empty room. It was placed in an oddly conspicuous spot and had a few stacks of cardboard boxes. As I got closer, I noticed dark stains on the walls and smudges on the bookshelf. They looked strange. Drawn by the oddity, I tried to take a closer look.
Is it making a knocking sound?
I thought I heard something and slowly moved closer to investigate. It sounded almost like something or someone was moving behind the bookshelf. Just as I reached out to touch it, Paul suddenly appeared in the doorway, asking, "What are you doing?" I quickly lied, saying I was just admiring some of the books. Glancing at the bookshelf, I smiled and asked,
Do you enjoy detective and mystery stories too? Let's talk about them.
but he gave a forced smile and nodded.
Sure. Now can you leave?
Seeing this, I decided to leave. After leaving, my mind was filled with questions. Why was Paul acting so strange? Why did that room feel so unsettling? It left me with a genuinely weird and uneasy feeling. I decided I would keep a closer eye on him for my own safety. A few days later, I kept observing and devised a plan. I stood in front of Paul's house with some pastries in hand, ready to knock and invite him to a Christmas gathering. As usual, Paul politely declined the invitation, but mentioned he might stop by later. A few minutes later, I saw Paul leave his house, get into his car, and drive off to somewhere suspicious. Seizing the opportunity, I cautiously made my way to the back of his house. He might return quickly, since the back door wasn't locked. I hesitated for a moment, considering leaving, unsure if this was the right thing to do. But then my eyes caught something that made me realize I couldn't hesitate any longer. I saw it, the trash can outside Paul's house. Items that didn't belong, rags stained with dark streaks and dried specks that looked like blood, and even children's clothing. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The door creaked open, and I slipped inside. The house was silent, eerily still. I cautiously moved toward the bookshelf I had seen and suspected earlier. As I approached the shelf, I fumbled around and noticed a book sticking out oddly. I grabbed it and pulled it out. As I pulled it, the bookshelf suddenly shifted, revealing a dark space that looked like a hidden room. I stepped inside and was utterly horrified. The room was a chaotic mess, boxes, shattered items, and strange objects scattered everywhere. In the far corner, something moved in the shadows. I took another step forward, feeling the weight of the air pressing down on me. Then, there he was, a little boy, trembling and trapped in the basement, his wide eyes filled with fear. My first instinct was to help the boy. I barely managed to remove the gag from his mouth when footsteps echoed through the house. Paul was back. My worst fear had come true. I quickly crouched down and whispered urgently to the boy, telling him to stay quiet as I guided him to hide. I hurriedly ran to find a different hiding spot, but Paul already suspected someone was in the house and began searching. He discovered me when I carelessly let part of my shirt show. He stomped on my shirt and said,
You shouldn't have come here.
Before I could react, Paul grabbed a nearby baseball bat and began swinging it forcefully at me. I barely dodged the first blow. Objects shattered around me. I rushed toward the kitchen, hoping to distract him and keep him away from the boy. My hand grabbed a pepper shaker, and I threw it into Paul's face to obscure his vision. But it didn't faze him at all. Taking advantage of his momentary blindness, I grabbed a frying pan and struck him on the head, forcing him to stagger back. The blows he landed on me left painful bruises, and his strength was greater than I had anticipated. I kept running to distract him, but I realized too late that he had gone down to the basement to find the boy. I called the police and ran down, throwing objects to distract him. I shouted at him to surrender, warning him that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. Paul pretended to surrender or negotiate, but he immediately launched a surprise attack when I let my guard down. Once again, I found myself at a disadvantage. He grabbed my neck and began choking me as I desperately reached for a glass bottle nearby, but I couldn't grasp it. I was nearly losing consciousness from the strangulation when, unexpectedly, the boy screamed, distracting Paul and giving me an opening. I seized the moment, grabbed the bottle, and struck him on the head. With a painful groan, Paul staggered back and finally released his grip on my neck. I quickly got up, pulled the boy up the basement stairs, and locked every door behind me. The police arrived within minutes, surrounding Paul's house. Paul was arrested, but what they uncovered left me horrified. The boy had been abducted from a completely different town and had been held in the basement for over 4 days. As for the flickering Christmas lights, the boy was a genius who had somehow figured out how to manipulate them from the basement as a cry for help to attract someone's attention outside. The nightmare was finally over. I was relieved that the boy was reunited with his family. I hoped he would go on to live a normal life and overcome this ordeal. The Nightmare Delivery Trip. Ryan, a hard-working pizza delivery driver, had been working night shifts for 2 years. His job usually involved driving, delivering, and collecting payments. Most nights went smoothly, but one fateful night changed everything. Near midnight, Ryan received the final delivery order of his shift. The address was on the outskirts of town, near the industrial area, a place he had never delivered to before. The streets were eerily deserted, with most streetlights flickering or completely off. The place always gave him a sense of isolation, but Ryan assumed it was just another late-night delivery. He saw a small, rundown house that didn't scream danger. Yet, something felt off about the place. At the end of the driveway stood a tall man wearing a gray coat and jeans. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at Ryan's car with an unsettling smile. Ryan hesitated but regained his composure, grabbed the pizza, and approached the man.
Hey, here's your pizza.
Ryan said, naming the price, but the man didn't rush to pay. Instead, the man slowly pulled out a handful of coins. He began counting them one by one, placing each coin into his other hand, as if performing some ritual. The air grew colder with each passing second. My fingers began to freeze around the pizza box. The man's grin widened as he said,
You drive too fast, Ryan.
Ryan froze. How did he know his name? Panic surged through him.
What?
Ryan stammered.
I don't know you. I don't think we've met before.
Then Ryan quickly backed away. He hurried back to his car, started the engine, and drove off. But when he glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw the man still standing there, holding the pizza and staring at him. But that wasn't the last time. A week later, near the end of his shift, Ryan's manager assigned him one final pizza delivery for the night, another strange order. The address was a house on the outskirts of town, near where he had gone before. The house he arrived at looked abandoned, with boarded-up windows and peeling paint. A note was taped to the door, delivered to the basement. A chill ran down Ryan's spine. Delivering to a basement was unusual. Reluctantly, needing to finish the job, he decided to follow the instructions. As he approached the basement door, he hesitated. A loud creak sounded as he opened it, revealing a narrow, chilly staircase leading down. Something felt off.
Hello?
Ryan called, his voice trembling, but there was no response. At the bottom, the basement stretched into darkness, with several doors lining the walls. One door was slightly ajar, with a faint light spilling out. The small room was dimly lit by a single lamp. In the center of the room was a figure of a man, entirely sculpted out of wax. It was almost perfectly life-sized, like a real person. At first, Ryan thought it was some kind of artwork. The figure slumped in a chair, its wax face eerie and lifelike, with deep eyes and a twisted, unsettling smile. The extraordinary detail made him shiver, wrinkles on the skin, hairs embedded perfectly in the wax. But there was something unsettling, a thin layer of moisture on the wax, making it seem as though it was sweating. Ryan placed the pizza box on the table, instinct urging him to leave. But something about the figure drew him closer. As he got closer, he noticed small cracks running along the wax skin. And then he saw it. Beneath one of the cracks was something red, a dark, congealed liquid. He didn't want to think it, but it might have been blood. Then, as he put his hand near the nose, he felt a faint breath. He leaned closer, and that's when he noticed the chest. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but the chest was rising and falling ever so slightly. Ryan turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind him. Ryan spun around to see a man stepping out from the corner of the room, tall, gaunt. It was him, the man Ryan had met earlier. He wore a dark apron, stained with streaks of wax and blood. In his hand, he held a brush dripping with molten wax. Ryan held his breath as he realized what the man intended. Just as he thought, the figure in the chair wasn't a sculpture but a person, encased in wax, still alive. The man stepped closer, holding the brush like a weapon.
You shouldn't have come here, but maybe you'll make a fine addition.
Ryan dashed for the door, but the man was quicker, grabbing his arm. His grip was cold and sticky, and Ryan could feel the wax coating his skin.
Help me.
Ryan turned to see the wax man's lips moving, his eyes darting desperately. It was the first sign of life he had shown. Ryan broke free from the man's grip, grabbed the desk lamp, and smashed it into the man's face. The bulb shattered, plunging the room into darkness. Ryan scrambled for the door, fumbling for the handle. Behind him, the man screamed in pain, and the buzzing in the air turned into a high-pitched shriek. Ryan bolted into the hallway, slamming the door behind him. When he finally made it home, He scrubbed at his skin, desperate to remove the faint traces of wax clinging to his arms. But no matter how hard he scrubbed, he couldn't shake the feeling it was still there. Ryan quit his job the next day and reported the incident to the police. He tried to forget what he had seen, but every night he was haunted by the image of the wax man's eyes. Mystery buried under the snow. Ryan had never truly clicked with Tyler, but they were still friends. Their relationship had always been complicated, marked by their differences in personality. Tyler was a complex, reserved guy with hidden corners of his life he never let anyone see. On the other hand, his mother, Diane, was the opposite, controlling, invasive, and suffocating. She seemed like a constant weight on his shoulders, though Tyler never outright said so. Their mother-son relationship might seem normal at first, but something about it never truly felt right. Diane constantly monitored Tyler with endless calls, texts, and surprise visits. He was never truly at ease during outings with friends, always explaining that he couldn't stay long because his mother would worry. When Tyler finally moved out, Ryan thought things would change for him. Diane paid his rent, of course, so she couldn't entirely let go, but Tyler initially seemed more at ease. But that didn't last. He started avoiding people, skipping gatherings, and dodging calls. Ryan thought Tyler was just adjusting to his new life, but one day, Ryan ran into him. Tyler, looking exhausted, waved him over and asked for help fixing a leaking faucet. When Ryan entered Tyler's apartment, everything seemed normal at first. However, there was an unsettling heaviness in the air. He noticed the backyard through the kitchen window was unusually dark. At first, Ryan thought it was someone in the yard, but upon closer inspection, he realized it was a massive snowman. Ryan frowned, jokingly pointing at it.
Who makes a snowman that big?
Tyler didn't reply, merely gesturing for him to focus on the faucet. Ryan stepped into the kitchen, scanning the area for the faucet. As he approached the sink, something caught his attention. Tiny blood-red spots on the floor near the sink, scattered unevenly. At first, he thought Tyler had cut himself while cooking or something similar. That's not unusual for someone as clumsy as him. At first, they weren't clear, but upon closer inspection, something seemed off. The stains weren't random. They seemed to form a trail leading out to the yard. His brows furrowed in confusion, but he didn't react immediately. Tyler stood nearby, distant, as if lost in thought, staring blankly at the TV. As Ryan knelt down to continue inspecting the faucet, something faintly glinted under the sink, catching his attention. It was a shiny keychain, stained with dried blood. Ryan's hand trembled slightly as he picked it up, immediately recognizing it. It belonged to Diane, Tyler's mother, the one she always carried with her. Panic set in as he realized something was wrong. At that moment, Ryan turned and saw Tyler, even though he'd heard him in the living room just seconds earlier, seemingly watching TV. His expression was blank, and he seemed unfocused.
Why is there blood on this? What's going on?
Tyler stayed silent, his gaze distant, as if calculating something. Before Ryan could react, Tyler reached across the table and grabbed a kitchen knife. His movements were slow but deliberate.
You're not allowed to leave.
Tyler lunged at Ryan with the knife. Instinctively, Ryan stepped back but tripped over a chair, falling to the floor. Tyler raised the knife again, stepping forward with clumsy but determined strides. Ryan raised his hands to defend himself, bracing for the worst. Tyler aimed for Ryan's chest. Ryan twisted on the ground, narrowly avoiding the blade. Tyler staggered, and that's when Ryan noticed it. The keychain was still in his hand.
Wait, Tyler, calm down.
Ryan shouted, but Tyler lunged again. In a desperate move, Ryan stabbed Tyler's leg with the blood-stained keychain. Tyler screamed in pain, stumbling back as he looked down at his leg. Rian seized the opportunity to get up and run toward the back door. He stumbled into the giant snowman. The impact caused it to collapse, revealing a horrifying sight beneath, a pale, trembling hand. And then the fingers twitched. It was Diane.
Help.
She whispered weakly. She clung to his coat, her eyes filled with tears.
I wanted him to be happy.
Rian dragged Diane toward the patio, his arms trembling with the effort. Rian turned to see Tyler, now staggering and disoriented, looking toward them. His knees buckled, and he collapsed into the snow, sobbing uncontrollably.
I just wanted to fix everything.
The sound of sirens tore through the night as the police arrived. Tyler didn't resist as they surrounded him. He just sat there, his head in his hands, mumbling incoherently. The investigation revealed Tyler's mental breakdown. In a twisted effort to conceal his mother, he had hidden Diane inside the snowman. Tyler was sentenced to life in a mental institution, his mind damaged beyond repair. The snowman was something Rian could never forget, the desperation of Tyler and the suffering of Diane. In the freezing cold of winter, he could never look at a snowman the same way again. The mysterious curse of donuts. Moving into a new house is always unsettling. John and his wife, Lisa, had just moved into an old house next to an abandoned Dunkin' Donuts, left in ruins nearly a decade ago. They had no idea the house harbored such a dark history. The fire had destroyed the building, leaving behind charred ruins and rumors of hauntings, which gave the area an eerie reputation. However, they never believed in such tales. At first, they enjoyed their new home and gradually adjusted to the quiet neighborhood. However, things quickly turned strange when a mysterious box of donuts began appearing on their doorstep every morning. It was a plain cardboard box, unmarked and without any notes, containing a dozen perfectly arranged donuts. John was suspicious, thinking it was some kind of prank, but Lisa, on the other hand, was delighted. She loved sweets, especially donuts. He brought the box inside, and Lisa eagerly opened it.
Look, they're fresh.
She exclaimed. He frowned.
I don't know. This seems a little strange.
John felt uneasy trusting food from strangers. Despite Lisa's claims that he was overreacting, John threw the donuts away. He didn't want to take any risks, but the next morning, it was back. Another box of donuts. He threw it away again, but the pattern continued. A few days later, a new neighbor moved in and brought them a box of donuts as a gift. John's instincts told him something was off, given the recent events. He gave a weak smile, took it inside, and threw it away. But one day when John came home, he found her eating a donut from the box. She dismissed his concerns with a weak laugh, saying,
It's just a donut.
That night, however, things took a disturbing turn. John woke to the sound of 3 knocks on the window, followed by 2 more. Then it intensified as he heard footsteps in the hallway and a strange bell ringing. It was a soft chime, like a hotel bell ringing. When John asked Lisa if she heard it, she mumbled in her sleep, turning her back to him. Over the next few days, the noises became more frequent. The knocks, footsteps, and bells. They felt like they were living in a nightmare. Lisa began acting strangely, growing distant and staring at the wall. One night, John found her standing completely still in the kitchen.
Lisa, what are you doing?
He asked, but she didn't reply. Suddenly, the same bell rang, and before he could react, she turned to him with a vacant stare and lunged at him with a knife in her hand. John narrowly dodged the knife, staggering backward. He escaped death by a hair's breadth, but Lisa's behavior grew increasingly erratic. Then she charged at him, as though possessed by madness. She began chasing John through the house, as if something was controlling her every move. However, as John reached the front door and flung it open, Lisa suddenly stopped. Her head jerked to one side, her neck twisting unnaturally as she stared at the abandoned Dunkin' Donuts building.
Lisa?
John called out, desperate.
What's happening to you?
But she didn't reply. She just began walking toward the ruins, her steps slow and deliberate. John followed her, keeping a safe distance. The neighbors began stepping out of their homes, drawn by the commotion. An elderly man approached John, his face pale and filled with confusion. He warned John that the building had a dark history. It had burned down 10 years ago, killing 6 people inside. He said, rumors claimed the place was cursed, though no one knew the full story. John looked at Lisa, who continued walking toward the burned ruins, oblivious to everything around her. The entrance was nothing but rubble and charred remains. She stepped inside and headed straight for the old counter. Fearful, John followed her, unable to leave her alone. Lisa bent down and picked something up from the debris. It was a tarnished desk bell, identical to the one John had heard in their house. Lisa placed it on an old countertop and began ringing it repeatedly, as if entranced. The sound echoed through the ruined building, sending a chilling wave through him. Not knowing what else to do, he shakily called the police. When the police arrived, Lisa was still standing there, her face void of expression, ringing the bell like a madwoman. They sedated her and took her away. They admitted her to a mental health facility, but she hasn't responded since. 2 years have passed, and Lisa still hasn't opened her eyes. John can't shake the feeling that the donuts somehow caused all of this. He wishes she had never eaten those donuts that The mystery of the dolls. Her name is Mari. She was on her way to Manor Street, covered in thick fog. Siri's voice alerted, "You have arrived at your destination." The silhouette of the mansion slowly emerged from the fog. Perched on a hill, surrounded by strange 18th century architecture, it looked like something from a nightmare, making her uneasy. She parked her car a block away and walked the rest of the way. The Coopers were an old, wealthy family, and tonight, she was babysitting their 10-year-old daughter. Mrs. Cooper had explained over the phone that their regular babysitter had an emergency, and they were willing to pay her triple her usual rate. The offer was too generous to refuse. As soon as she stepped in, Mrs. Cooper, a pale and frail woman, greeted her on the porch with a forced smile. She told her, "Bridget is upstairs. I've left instructions on the table. Please, don't bother her too much." Mrs. Cooper kept glancing around, as if there was something she couldn't tell Mari. Mari walked down the dark, seemingly endless hallway. She followed the instructions left for her, leading to the room at the end of the corridor. When she entered, she saw Bridget sitting in the middle of the room. Her large black eyes seemed too old for her face. She was clutching a porcelain doll, its face eerily lifelike. She greeted Bridget, but Bridget remained silent, her eyes fixed on the doll. The room was filled with dolls, porcelain faces, shiny hair, all meticulously arranged around the room. Mari shuddered at how real their hair looked. She tried to engage Bridget with stories and games, but the girl remained eerily silent. Hours passed in strange silence until finally, around 10 p.m., Bridget said she was sleepy. Mari led Bridget to the bedroom, and that's when she noticed something was wrong. The girl began moving toward the dolls, saying, "They are my slaves." She could hardly believe her ears. She never expected something like that to come from a child. She knew she needed to keep a closer eye on the girl. By 2 a.m., she had dozed off on the couch. A sudden noise startled her awake. She groggily rubbed her eyes, trying to make sense of everything, when she realized someone was standing behind her. She thought it was Bridget. She couldn't believe her eyes. The girl's face was twisted, her features deformed, aging grotesquely. She clutched the doll tightly in her hands and muttered, "I like your eyes. I will have them." Fear gripped her as Bridget lunged at her with an unnatural strength for a child. She fell to the floor, the weight of Bridget's small body pinning her down. She screamed in vain as Bree's hands scratched her face. "I will take your eyes," Bridget hissed, her voice rasping as if it belonged to someone else. The girl began pulling at a handful of her hair wildly, gleefully. With all her strength, she shoved the child off. She ran down the long hallway, glancing back to see Bridget enraged, chasing her madly. In desperation, she grabbed a decorative figure from a side table and hurled it at Bridget. It struck her forehead, and Bridget screamed in pain, staggering back. But it wasn't enough to stop her. She ran until she burst through the front door, flagging down a passing car. The driver, alarmed by her disheveled appearance, helped her get to the nearest police station. When she returned to the mansion with the police, the truth revealed was more horrifying than anything she could have imagined. Bridget wasn't a little girl. The woman she had been babysitting was a dwarf, Mrs. C, Cooper's deformed sister, whose body never grew but whose mind had twisted into something monstrous over the years. She often comes to the mansion, kills them in their sleep, and collects what she likes. But what she likes the most is their hair. She will use it to make dolls. The police uncovered 7 bodies in the backyard, all young women, all missing their hair. The porcelain dolls in Bridget's room were adorned with their scalps, their hair meticulously attached to the dolls she called her slaves. Mrs. Cooper had been covering up her sister's crimes for years, burying the bodies and protecting her in some inexplicable way. The police arrested both women. She now sat in her small apartment, still haunted by the events of that night. She no longer babysat, and just the sight of a doll made her heart race. The memory of Bridget still haunted her dreams. The secret buried in the basement. This is a true story, something that happened to me when I was a child, but to this day, I'm still haunted when I think about it. I lived in a suburban neighborhood back then, right next to a childhood friend named Ben and his little sister Maggie. We would always play together, especially in their front yard. Even then, I could tell something wasn't right. Ben and Maggie always looked skinny and malnourished, and their clothes were always old and tattered. Their house, too, was a sight that scared me. The lawn was overgrown, windows cracked, and the walls eaten away by termites. I always assumed it was because their mother had passed away years ago, and the house hadn't been cared for since. Speaking of their father, I was always terrified of seeing him. He was muscular, with horrible burn scars. It wasn't just his appearance. His voice was always angry, and he constantly yelled at them. One time, when we were playing in the front yard, he came home unexpectedly and scolded Ben for letting me onto their property. He grabbed me by the collar and threatened to give me a beating if he ever saw me near their house again. I panicked and cried the whole way home after that incident. After a while, I completely stopped seeing Maggie. She just disappeared. I feared that something terrible had happened to her. I overheard my parents talking about Ben's father. He was a veteran who had been dishonorably discharged after massacring a village full of innocent civilians. Another strange thing was that the body of his wife, Ben's mother, was never found. There were rumors that he had killed her too. Ben and I continued to play together, even though my parents warned me not to. One of his favorite games was hide and seek. Ben was a master at it. One day, while we were playing hide and seek in the yard, Ben suggested something crazy, playing hide and seek inside his house. I was hesitant, but honestly, a part of me had always been curious about what the inside of their house looked like. So, I agreed and went in. As I had expected, the place was a mess. Broken light bulbs, empty beer cans in every corner, and food stains on the walls. It looked more like a refuge camp than a house. Then I noticed something suspicious. The basement door was locked and chained shut. Ben told me I could hide anywhere, including the upstairs bedrooms, but I was never allowed to go into the basement, under any circumstances. I found the perfect hiding spot, an old, large wooden wardrobe. I slipped inside and shut the door. As I leaned back against the wall, it shifted. Losing my balance, I fell right through the cracked wall and tumbled into a dark place, what seemed like the basement. I stood up and tried to find my way out. The fear was overwhelming, and I couldn't stay calm. The stuffed animals mounted on the walls seemed to be staring at me. Then I heard crying coming from a chained door in the basement. I slowly moved closer and peeked through the crack in the door. I was shocked to see Maggie chained to a furnace. She had wounds all over her body and looked like she hadn't eaten in days. Before I could react, I heard the basement door open. Ben's father had returned and was coming down the stairs. I quickly hid behind a large shield. He spotted my footprints and immediately knew someone else was in the basement. He searched for me, coming within inches of my hiding spot before Ben came down the stairs, distracting him. He grabbed Ben by the collar and shouted angrily. I seized the opportunity to sneak out, but not before exchanging a quick look with Ben. As soon as I got home, I told my parents everything that had happened. Within hours, Ben's father was arrested. It turned out he had been punishing them by locking them in the basement without food or water for days. He was suffering from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and had taken his rage out on his children. Afterward, Ben and Maggie were sent to live with their aunt in North Carolina. I never saw or heard from them again. The eccentric neighbor upstairs. I grew up in a small suburban area, living in a quiet apartment on the second floor, right next to the stairs leading up to the third floor. There was one thing that always bothered me, the man who lived upstairs, almost as if he was the only one there. Mr. Huns was a middle-aged man who never spoke to anyone in the building. The kids in the building avoided him. Every morning, Mr. Huns would walk down to the sidewalk in front of his apartment and, with an odd, meticulous habit, water the grass. Only the grass. No flowers, no bushes, just small patches of grass by the sidewalk. His movements were strange, almost robotic. No one ever spoke to him. He was the kind of person everyone avoided. One night, Charlie came over for a sleepover. We watched a basketball game that evening and then went to bed. But Charlie couldn't let it go. He became obsessed with learning more about Mr. Huns.
Does he have a wife? A family?
Charlie sat up, his curiosity reigniting. His face lit up with a mischievous grin, and before I knew it, he was heading for the door. I hated this, but out of concern, I reluctantly followed him. We snuck out of our apartment and headed up to the third floor. I stayed back to lock the door before leaving. Charlie was already going up the stairs. I caught a glimpse of him.
Charlie, please stop, don't.
When I reached the top, I saw Charlie standing outside Mr. Huns' apartment, his right hand on the doorbell.
Charlie, what the heck? Stop it!
Without warning, Charlie turned to me and said,
Get ready to run. All right, run.
We bolted down the stairs like our lives depended on it.
Who's there?
I heard Mr. Huns stepping out of his apartment. Then the door slammed shut behind us, and we could hear his footsteps coming closer and closer. We gasped for breath, panicking as we ran down the hallway. Reaching my door, Charlie began to freak out, and I broke into a sweat when I realized I didn't have the keys. Charlie yanked me into a dimly lit storage room at the end of the hall. We crouched behind a pile of boxes, trying to make ourselves as small as possible so he wouldn't see us. Minutes passed as we carefully listened to the diminishing sound of footsteps, fading into near silence. We thought he had left and sighed in relief. Just as we turned the corner in the hallway, a few seconds later, I felt something was off. Suddenly, I was grabbed by the collar from behind. Charlie was walking ahead of me, so who was behind me? I slowly turned my head to look, and it was him. He had a firm grip on my shirt, and my feet were no longer touching the ground. Then, he lifted me into the air. Charlie froze, his mind spinning. Too scared, he ran away and left me there. I felt like I was being suffocated by his strength. The man leaned in close to my face and said,
Hey kid, you messed with the wrong person.
In my despair, as my vision began to blur, I saw Charlie coming back. He moved silently, like a shadow, sneaking up behind the man. He was signaling to me. I understood and started struggling against the man to distract him. Taking advantage of the man's distraction, Charlie kicked the back of his knee, causing him to stumble and lose balance, making me fall to the ground as well. Seizing the opportunity, we escaped right then and there. Once we were outside the apartment, everything would be over. Reaching the first floor, Charlie ran to the emergency exit and banged on it, but it seemed to be locked. Realizing that we might not escape, just then, the door opened from the outside. A woman was there, asking what we were doing. I heard his footsteps growing fainter. Perhaps we had escaped. When we got back home, Charlie and I were punished. Later, he showed me a newspaper article featuring Mr. Huns. He was a former patient, someone abnormal ever since his wife had gone missing and could not be found. Despite many efforts, they couldn't find his wife. When they searched his house, instead of food in his pantry, they found jars filled with dead bugs. Many speculated that they were his food, but I think this is enough. We won't dig any deeper. In the end, perhaps we should be more cautious with our jokes and thoughts to avoid bad consequences. Strange Grinch Toy. Ethan had always been fascinated by the Grinch. His house was filled with Grinch memorabilia, from posters to collectibles. He viewed the Grinch as a misunderstood genius, and his collection was a tribute to this eccentric character. One day, while wandering through a flea market, Ethan stumbled upon an old, dusty Grinch toy. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. Its fur was matted and patchy, its grin unnaturally wide, and its eyes impossibly deep. When Ethan picked it up, it was warm. Not warm as if it had been sitting in the sun, but warm as if it were alive. His chest tightened, and he reassured himself it was just excitement. Ethan asked the seller for the price, but the man didn't even look at him. He muttered, "Take it, it's free," and told him to leave. Ethan placed the toy on the shelf in the center of his Grinch collection. As he stared at it, a creeping sensation ran down his spine, as if it were staring back. That's when things started to go wrong. The presence of the toy made him uneasy, and Ethan began hearing whispers in his house. As the days went by, every time he passed a mirror, his reflection became distorted. Sometimes his face would morph into a grotesque Grinch-like grin. Before it returned to normal, the decorations around his house seemed different. The Grinch figurines on his shelf appeared to change. When Ethan wasn't paying attention, their grins thinned, their eyes deepened. The whispers grew louder, and everything felt stranger. And then the dreams began to haunt him. In his dreams, Ethan saw him every night, tormented by a taller version of the Grinch. It had patchy green fur, a jagged, wide grin, and eyes glowing with malice. The Grinch watched Ethan from the foot of his bed, whispering things Ethan couldn't understand, but one phrase stuck with him.
Come with me.
Ethan woke up drenched in sweat, his heart racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. His obsession with the Grinch now seemed to control him. That's when Ethan began digging. He needed answers and spent days researching, scouring obscure forums and books dedicated to Christmas folklore. Then Ethan stumbled upon an old legend, a cursed Grinch toy mentioned in a book. According to folklore, the toy was not just a collectible but a trap. It fed on its owner's obsession, gradually transforming them into the very thing they admired most. Something inside Ethan didn't want to believe it, but he tried to get rid of the toy and threw it in the trash. That night, Ethan saw images of the Grinch everywhere, even hearing its voice in his head. The whispers were no longer vague but became clearer.
Let me in.
Or,
You are part of me now.
but the next morning, it was back on the shelf. Ethan tried burning it, but the toy reappeared, its grin even wider. Each failed attempt to destroy it only deepened his fear and obsession. Ethan lost his mind on Christmas Eve. That was the last time he truly saw himself. This time, however, it wasn't Ethan in the mirror, it was the Grinch. Then it morphed back into his face, but it was stitched at the edges. His body trembled as he began to feel something changing inside him. Ethan screamed and punched the mirror. That was when he realized he was no longer just seeing the Grinch. He was becoming the Grinch. In a moment of madness, Ethan stood in the bathroom, staring into the mirror with a knife in his hand, blood dripping from his cheek. Now, Ethan's face bled from the wound as he carved the grin deeper. His obsession had pushed him beyond the limits of sanity. When he woke up, he was in a psychiatric hospital, surrounded by doctors and nurses who deemed him dangerous. He had harmed himself. They couldn't comprehend the curse that had consumed him. His neighbors had brought him there due to his madness. They mocked him, calling him Grinch, not realizing that what Ethan saw was real. Every night, Ethan would still see it, the Grinch, standing in the dark corner of his room, flashing a sinister grin. Highway Trap Maker. It had been a long day of driving for me. I glanced at the dashboard clock. It was nearly 9 p.m. I stopped at a small gas station, dimly lit, filled up the tank, and bought an energy drink from the store. The cool night air brushed against my face as I stretched before climbing back into the truck. With a 3-hour drive ahead, I settled into the seat, ready for the journey. The open road stretched out before me, desolate, bathed in the soft glow of the headlights. My only companion was the music playing through the cabin. I drifted a bit, feeling slightly drowsy, and quickly focused back on the road, allowing my mind to wander as I sipped my drink, hoping it would help keep me awake. Around 11 p.m., a sudden crackle pulled me from my drowsiness. The sound came from the radio I had on the trucker channel. With everything so quiet, the noise startled me. Through the static, I thought I heard a voice, faint and unclear. The words were difficult to make out, but it sounded like hello or help. My heart raced a little faster as I glanced around, looking into the darkness behind the headlights, but there were no other vehicles in sight. I grabbed the radio and pressed the button, my voice trembling as I asked, "Is anyone out there? Do you need help?" I waited, listening to the static fill the silence, but there was no response. Just as I was about to release the button, my headlights caught something ahead on the road. I slowed the truck down, coming to a stop as I saw a large rig parked in the middle of the road, motionless. It was strange. There were no signs of anyone around, no lights, nothing at all. I pulled over to the side and climbed out, the chill of the night air making me shiver. As I approached the rig, I called out, my voice breaking the strange silence. "Hello? Is anyone there?" But my voice was swallowed by the emptiness around me. I climbed into the open door of the truck and looked inside. My heart sank as I realized it was empty. There was no one inside. The driver's seat vacant, but a jacket hung over the passenger seat, a half-finished cup of coffee in the holder. The radio was silent now, but a faint static still lingered in the air. It was as if the driver had simply vanished. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no clues as to where they had gone. A shiver ran down my spine, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave this place, a growing sense of unease gnawing at me. I stepped away from the rig, scanning my surroundings, my eyes sweeping over the dark fields on either side of the road. The tall grass swayed, casting eerie shadows that shifted under the moonlight. Then something peculiar caught my eye, a faded photo pinned to the dashboard. I squinted in the dim light, leaning in for a closer look. It was a family photo, the kind you might get at a cheap roadside stand. A man stood with his wife and daughter, smiling, carefree. I didn't recognize the man, but there was something in his expression that filled me with a sense of sadness. I stepped back, my gaze lingering on the photo as a chill ran down my spine. That's when I realized this truck wasn't just abandoned. Perhaps it was a trap, deliberately left here to lure someone, anyone, into this desolate stretch of road. A twig snapped behind me, the sudden noise cutting through the night like a knife. My instincts kicked in, and I whipped around just in time to see a figure emerging from the darkness, their face obscured. My heart raced as I took a step back, my mind scrambling for a plan. I was alone, isolated, surrounded only by trees and an empty highway. I couldn't run. He would catch me in seconds. Thinking quickly, I scrambled back into the empty truck, my hands shaking as I rummaged through the cabin. I found a wrench on the floor and gripped it tightly, crouching down inside the truck, preparing myself as I listened for approaching footsteps. The figure approached the open door, his face finally illuminated by the moonlight. He was grinning widely, a cold, threatening smile that made me shudder, and I realized with horrifying clarity that he had done this before. He stepped closer, moving slowly and deliberately, savoring the fear in my eyes. But I wouldn't go down without a fight. I charged at him, swinging the wrench with all my might, catching him off guard. We stumbled out of the truck, struggling on the ground. The night came alive with the sounds of our scuffle, grunts and the scrape of shoes on gravel. He was stronger than I was, but desperation fueled me, making me fight harder, faster. I tried to break free, staggering to my feet as he pulled back, clutching his shoulder. For a moment, we just stared at each other, both of us breathing heavily, the tension thick and suffocating. I gripped the wrench tightly, ready, but he hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty passing over his face. I seized on his hesitation, advancing with the wrench raised. He stepped back, the threat in his eyes replaced with something else, perhaps fear. He turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness, the sound of his footsteps fading until there was nothing but silence. I climbed back into my truck, locking the doors as I settled into the seat, my hands still trembling from what had just happened. I reached for the radio, my voice barely above a whisper as I called for help, my words spilling out in a rush. I told them everything: the abandoned truck, the photo, the man who attacked me. They assured me that help was on the way, that the police would be there soon. The flashing lights of the police car cut through the night, a relief after feeling like the darkness stretched on forever. I watched as the officers investigated the scene, their flashlights casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. One of the officers approached me, his expression grim as he recounted what they had found. The truck belonged to a man reported missing weeks ago. A man with a family, a wife and young daughter. They suspected foul play, but there was currently no sign of him. The man, they found footprints leading into the woods, but they ended abruptly, as if he had vanished into thin air. It was as if the darkness itself had swallowed him, leaving nothing but an unsettling silence. The sun began to rise as I sat in the truck. The police had temporarily concluded their investigation, saying they would keep me updated, that they would do everything they could to find the missing man and bring the attacker to justice. I took a deep breath, gripping the steering wheel tightly. I didn't know what awaited me ahead, but I knew one thing. I had survived that night and escaped the trap he had set. A few days later, I was called to the police station to discuss the investigation. A policeman sat across from me, his eyes serious as he flipped through a thick stack of papers. He explains that they have identified both the attacker and the missing man, piecing together the details of a dark plot. The attacker, a vagrant with a violent history, was responsible for a series of disappearances along this stretch of highway. He preyed on both truckers and tourists, luring them in with abandoned cars, like the one I found, using them as bait to satisfy his twisted sense of control. The man in the photo is one of his victims, but this time, the attacker did not escape. After he ran away from me that night, he made a mistake, leaving behind clues that led the police to him. They find him hiding in an old, dilapidated farmhouse on the outskirts of town, the walls covered with memorabilia stolen from his victims. The officer who showed me the photo from the abandoned truck, now sealed in a plastic evidence bag, told me they would notify the victim's family. I stared at the photo, feeling a mixture of relief and bitterness, knowing that this monster would no longer haunt the highway, no longer tear apart the lives of innocent people. Mysterious man on the cruise ship. Our large family gathered for dinner, celebrating my grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary. The ship was filled with laughter and chatter as we enjoyed dinner on the last night of our cruise. This was my first time on a cruise. My sister, cousins, and I were incredibly excited, running around the ship. After dinner, the adults stayed behind to play and chat, while the kids headed up to the deck to enjoy the quiet night, eager to experience one last bit of adventure before bed. The night was perfect. The sky was covered in a blanket of stars, clearer and more than anywhere I had ever seen before. The ship glided gently through the dark waters as we lounged on the deck, sharing scary stories, but that peace was quickly shattered. Around 11:30 p.m., we decided to head to the game room, and I noticed him a solitary figure sitting near the railing. He was tall and thin, with unkempt hair sticking out from under a winter hat, despite the warm night air. His long coat seemed out of place, and his head tilted slightly, as if he were either sleeping or staring out to sea. I was the last to pass by him, and as I walked by, I couldn't help but glance back over my shoulder to watch him. He remained still, but then I heard his voice. It was more of a mumble, deep and fragmented, almost inaudible over the sound of the ship gliding through the water. When I turned back, the man was standing up. He took a step towards me, his face now only partially illuminated by the dim lights on the deck, gaunt, with deep-set eyes in the darkness. In his outstretched hand, he held something and asked if I wanted to buy it. I looked down at what he was holding, a small, crude voodoo doll, with button eyes sewn on and limbs twisted unnaturally. I gasped, and without thinking further, I declined and left for the bright, noisy game room, a stark contrast to the eerie silence above. Suddenly, the door leading into the game room creaked open. I felt a chilling sea breeze brush against my skin. I turned back and saw him there. The tall man from the deck had followed me inside. He stood in the doorway, staring at me. I didn't wait for him to approach and urged my sister and cousins to leave the area. We hurried out of the game room, making our way towards the lounge where the adults were chatting and playing. Once inside, my parents kissed us goodnight, and we began to head back to our room to prepare for bed. The room was small but cozy. I lay on the bed, the soothing sound of the engine lulling us into a sense of safety. I tried to forget the man's face, The way he stared at me, the strange voodoo doll he tried to sell. The gentle rocking of the ship quickly put us to sleep, but it didn't last long. Around 1 a.m., I was jolted awake by a horrifying scream. It was my sister. When I turned on the light, I saw him there. The man from the deck was sitting in the corner of our room, hunched over one of the chairs, his knees nearly touching his chin due to his height. Then he slowly stood up. Before we could react, he stumbled over his own feet, crashing into the bathroom. I ran over and slammed the bathroom door shut. We quickly barricaded the door with a chair. We screamed for help. Our parents rushed over and immediately called for ship security, who arrived within minutes, hands ready to cuff. The security team opened the bathroom door, dragging the tall man out. His eyes were wild, and he mumbled incoherently, his long limbs flailing awkwardly as they restrained him. We later learned that the man was not a registered passenger on the ship. He wasn't on the manifest, and no one could figure out how he got on board. They suspected he had some sort of mental disorder. When they tried to question him, he barely responded, and they locked him in a holding cell below deck for the remainder of the trip. I returned to my room and lay on the bed, staring up at the ceiling. Even though the man was now locked below deck, an unsettling anxiety still enveloped me. Hours passed, and sleep came in short, restless bursts. I jolted awake again, this time to a faint noise. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Then I heard it again, a faint dragging sound, as if something was being pulled across the floor. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound stopped, replaced by a slow creaking. My heart raced. It was coming from the bathroom. I sat up, my hands gripping the edge of the bed. The bathroom door was ajar, and I stared at it, but there was nothing, just the open door and a chilling silence. I gathered my courage and swung my legs off the bed. I slowly walked toward the bathroom. As I reached the door, my hand trembled. I pushed it open. The bathroom was empty, but on the floor, just inside the doorway, was a voodoo doll. I gasped, stumbling back. The doll was still there, its stitched eyes seeming to glare at me from the floor. I bent down, hesitating before picking it up. The doll was made of coarse, dirty fabric, its stitching uneven, and it felt heavier than it should, as if it carried something dark. Suddenly, I heard a whisper, just like before when the man had given it to me on the deck, as if the doll itself were alive, trying to say something to me. I dropped the doll, my hand trembling. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and a cold gust of wind swept through, even though no windows were open. My breath quickened as I stared, frozen in place. The doll began to move. It slowly slid across the floor, getting closer to my bed. Then suddenly, my bedroom door swung open, revealing the tall man standing in the doorway, his gaunt figure silhouetted by the dim hallway light. His eyes no longer held the wildness they once had. Instead, they were empty. Suddenly, the lights flickered as if responding to an unseen force. The man took a step closer, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. In a panic, I pushed the man with all my strength, and to my surprise, he fell to the ground like a puppet with its strings cut. But even as he lay there, motionless, the doll continued to move. Without hesitation, I grabbed the doll and ran to the window. My hands trembled as I tried to open it, but eventually, I managed to. The cold night air rushed in, and with all my strength, I threw the doll into the sea. The doll vanished into the dark waters below, swallowed by the depths of the ocean. For a moment, everything was silent. The whispers ceased, the lights flickered once more, and then everything fell still. The man on the floor suddenly vanished, his form seemingly dissolving into the air in an inexplicable manner. We stood there, stunned, unsure of what had just happened. I fell to the floor, trembling. Perhaps it was all over. The nightmare was finally over. The next morning, we packed up our things and left the room without looking back. When I reached the desk, the cruise staff looked puzzled as we recounted our encounter with the man, who had been found dead right there for no apparent reason. It had happened suddenly. I sensed that he and that doll had some connection that I couldn't comprehend. As I stepped off the ship, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man, whatever he was, and the doll carried something dark, and that we were the targets. I could still feel its chilling touch on my skin, and deep down, I knew we had escaped something far worse than we could comprehend. The threat of the gas station customer. Evie had been working the night shift at the gas station for many years. It was always quiet, slow, and uneventful. Her shifts usually started at 8 p.m. every day. The first few hours passed quickly, with a steady stream of customers coming in for gas or snacks. But after 11 p.m., the traffic slowed, and by midnight, the station became eerily quiet. She tried to keep herself busy, organizing merchandise on the shelves and cleaning, but there wasn't much to do. The silence and the ticking of the clock made the second half of her shift feel endless. Around 1 a.m., a car pulled into one of the parking spots near the entrance. At first, she didn't think much of it. Most cars came in for gas and left immediately. But this car just sat there. No one got out. She stood up straight behind the counter, waiting for anyone inside to come in. She leaned over the counter, looking through the glass door, but nothing happened. Maybe they were just resting? She shrugged and continued scrolling on her phone, distracted for about 20 minutes. When she looked up from her phone, there, standing in one of the aisles, was a man. He was just there, staring at her. She hadn't heard the doorbell, hadn't seen him walk in. How had he gotten inside without her noticing? The man quickly averted his gaze when he saw her looking. He appeared to be in his 40s floor, wearing a dark coat and a scruffy beanie. There was something about him that made her uneasy. He moved slowly through the aisles, his eyes occasionally glancing toward her, as if assessing whether she was watching him. His movements were deliberate, almost calculated. She tried to remain calm, watching him closely, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was planning something bad. Suddenly, he turned toward the front door and hurried outside. She dashed out the door, her heart racing. The car was still parked there, but the man walked right past it, disappearing into the darkness along the road. She went straight to the security camera to figure out how he had gotten in without her noticing. She pulled up the footage, scanning through until she found the moment he arrived. The footage showed him stepping out of the parked car, but instead of going inside immediately, he stealthily made his way around to the back of the gas station. There were no cameras there, but she knew those doors were never locked because they were broken. What chilled her the most was the timing. 15 minutes passed between the moment he went behind the building and when he appeared in the store. 15 minutes he spent lurking out of sight, waiting for something. Weeks had passed since that night, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shift felt like a test for her. One night, while she was cleaning the counters, she noticed something strange. The man entered the store, his eyes scanning as if searching for something. She watched him from the corner of her eye, and that was when she saw it. Something that seemed horrific. Then he approached her checkout, and she thought she might have guessed right. Dark stains on his sleeve, splotches that looked like blood clinging to the fabric, and he had done something vile and horrible. She wasn't sure if it was the same man, but she sensed it was him by his stature and clothing. She froze, her hands clenched, as he slowly moved down the aisle, seemingly oblivious to her stare. He quickly slipped away, melting into the shadows, and she was left in silence. She resolved to take action. The next time he appeared, she would be ready. A few nights later, he returned. She heard the faint sound of the doorbell, and looked up to see him standing right inside, his face hidden in the shadows. She quietly picked up the phone, dialed the police, and kept her voice just above a whisper. She reported the suspicious man, describing his erratic behavior and the blood she had seen on his sleeve. But then, he noticed her. His eyes narrowed, and he realized what she was doing. Without warning, he charged toward her, knocking the phone from her hand. She stumbled back, grabbing anything she could use to defend herself as he backed her into a corner, his face contorted into a disturbing grin. She collided with the shelves, knocking items to the floor. She tried to grab a can from a nearby rack and threw it at him, buying herself a split second to dodge him and run toward the door. But he was quick, grabbing her arm and pulling her back, forcing her against the back of the store. I encouraged myself to survive and reassured myself that the police would arrive soon. He tightened his grip and pressed his face close to hers with a terrifying gaze. She felt panic rising, but she saw the police through the glass. One of the officers raised an eyebrow and glanced at her, then looked at the man's hand on her arm. It was a signal, a silent cue. She knew what she had to do. Gathering all her courage, she turned slightly, catching the man off guard, and bit his hand. He yelled in pain, loosening his grip just enough for her to escape. She stumbled forward, getting out of his reach. The police burst through the door, quickly advancing with their weapons drawn. He hesitated, his face contorted with anger, but he knew he was outnumbered. The officers moved in, bringing him to the ground and cuffing his hands behind his back. He thrashed, his eyes filled with rage as they restrained him. One of the officers approached her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. They said he was a dangerous man, wanted for multiple assaults and murders in the city. She blinked, the reality of his words sinking in. A murderer? The thought sent chills down her spine, and she felt the weight of the encounter heavier than ever. She nodded, grateful that he had finally been apprehended. The man hadn't just been lurking around the police station. He had been hiding, waiting, blending into the shadows, ready to strike. The police finished their reports, and she was left alone in the quiet gas station. The shelves were disarrayed, items scattered after their struggle. The man was gone, but she couldn't shake off the horror of it all. The scars he left would remain with her, a reminder of the darkness lurking just beyond the light. Strangers on the 6th floor. It was late, and the apartment building loomed tall against the misty sky, the dim lights flickering in the fog. The street was quiet, deserted except for the occasional sound of cars in the distance. I wanted to take a walk to get some fresh air. As I walked toward the elevator, the air suddenly turned cold, sending a shiver down my spine. The elevator doors slid open. I stepped inside, pressed the button for the first floor. The elevator started descending. Suddenly, it stopped at the 6th floor. The doors slid open with a small creak, and there stood a woman. She was thin, with hollow cheeks, and her messy hair hung over her face. Dark circles surrounded her lifeless eyes. I felt uneasy as I noticed she was barefoot, her dirty feet resting on the cold elevator floor. She stepped inside, clutching her stomach as if she were in pain. Her head remained down, and her movements were slow and deliberate. I moved to the other side of the elevator, holding my breath as she took her place. Something about her appearance left me feeling unsettled. Her dirty dress, her gaunt face, she looked like a homeless person. Her gaze stayed fixed on the elevator floor, scanning as if searching for something invisible, even though there was nothing there. She never looked up, her hands trembling. I began to feel afraid just looking at her. When the elevator reached the 1st floor, I rushed out, not daring to look back. I quickly exited the building, trying to shake off the encounter. but questions lingered in my mind. Who was that woman? She didn't seem like she belonged here. A little while later, I returned to the building. I pressed the elevator button, eager to get back to my apartment. When the doors opened, my heart skipped a beat. She was there again. This time, she was crawling on the ground, her face pressed against the floor. Her hands frantically moved across the cold floor, still searching for something. The sight was so strange, so terrifying, that I hesitated at the entrance. For a moment, I considered taking the stairs, but something urged me to step inside. My heart raced as I pressed the button for the 9th floor. The elevator began to rise, but it stopped again at the 6th floor. The doors opened, and she crawled out, her body moving slowly along the hallway floor. I watched her disappear into the darkness, my mind spinning. What was she looking for? All night, I couldn't stop thinking about that woman. She must have been a homeless person who had lost her mind and broken into the building. I tried to convince myself that was the only explanation, but the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. A few days later, I woke up early for a morning run. It was still quite early, so the building and hallways were quiet. As I approached the elevator, I pressed the button, feeling a bit anxious, as I remembered the woman from the other night. The elevator descended and stopped once again at the 6th floor. The doors slid open. This time, it was a man. He was barefoot, just like the woman. His hair was messy, his clothes filthy. He hunched over, one hand clutching his stomach. His face was pale, his eyes vacant. He stepped into the elevator, moving slowly, as if in pain. My heart started to race. The similarities were too striking to ignore. I whispered, "Are you okay? What are you looking for?" The man turned to look at me, his eyes staring into mine. They were hollow, lifeless, his face contorted in pain. His voice was hoarse as he mumbled, "I've lost something. My stomach hurts." Before I could respond, he collapsed onto the floor, lying face down just like the woman. He started crawling, dragging his hands across the floor, searching for something invisible. Everything about it was eerie and terrifying. When the doors opened, I bolted out of the elevator immediately, my whole body trembling with fear. I had no idea what was waiting for me next or how I would face it. The morning sunlight shone through the dusty window as I entered the apartment management office, my nerves still on edge from the strange events of the past few days. I needed answers, anything to explain the bizarre encounters in the elevator. I entered the management office and told him about the strange things I had seen. I mentioned seeing some strange people using the elevator from the 6th floor. They looked like a homeless couple, barefoot and dirty. They always held their stomachs, as if they were in pain. The man frowned and pulled out a list of tenants. He glanced over it and then looked back at me, shaking his head. He said no such couple existed. No one matching my description lived on the 6th floor. I stood there, stunned. If no one lived there, then who were the people I had seen? Still uneasy, I headed to the mailroom, hoping that doing something simple like picking up my mail would calm my nerves. When I opened the mailbox, something caught my eye. It was the maintenance bill for the 6th floor. 2 rooms were listed, 601 and 602, along with a water bill. One strange thing I noticed was that the water bill for room 602 was unusually high. I blinked, staring at the numbers. It didn't make sense. How could someone use that much water? Something was really off. A few nights later, I returned to my apartment after a late night at work. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was happening on the 6th floor. As the elevator doors slid open, I froze. Inside the elevator stood a large man, holding a long, heavy golf bag. There was a strange odor, a faint metallic smell wafting through the air. I glanced at the elevator control panel. The button for the 6th floor was lit. When the doors opened on the 6th floor, he stepped out, carrying the bag down the dark hallway toward room 602. I waited until he disappeared before stepping out of the elevator, my heart pounding. I glanced down and saw tiny drops of something dark on the floor that looked like blood. I had no idea what he was carrying in that bag. Back in my apartment, I couldn't sit still. My mind raced, piecing together the strange encounters. The barefoot couple, the blood, the water bill. Something horrific was happening in room 602. After pacing for what felt like hours, I finally picked up the phone and called the police. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cars illuminated the street outside my building. I watched from the window as the officers entered, heading straight to the 6th floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited, wondering what they would find. Minutes passed, and I could only pace back and forth in my apartment, too anxious to sit down. Finally, I saw the police return. Their faces were grim, and one of them motioned for me to come down. I rushed down the stairs to meet them. I asked what they had found. They told me that inside room 602, they found a makeshift surgery room. There was blood everywhere. They also found a freezer and suspicious golf bags. Inside them were dismembered bodies. Their organs had been removed. I felt nauseous. Organ trafficking, right in my building. I could hardly comprehend it. I also asked them about the barefoot couple I had seen in the elevator, and they said there was no one else there that matched my description. Determined to understand what had happened, I asked to see the elevator security footage. As the video played, my heart raced. I saw myself in the elevator, but I was alone, talking to no one. I felt numb. 3 days later, I received the final report from the police. The autopsy had been completed. The victims found in room 602 were all homeless. The people I saw in the elevator were likely the spirits of the 6th floor. They had been tragically taken by criminals and were still searching for something, perhaps a part of themselves. The Stranger's Chase at Dunkin' Donut. It was just another regular shift at Dunkin', where I work part-time. The night shift is my usual shift, and tonight was no different. We usually close at 9 p.m., and I've grown used to the quiet that settles over the store as night falls. We had to clean up everything, and my coworker hadn't shown up yet, but that wasn't unusual. I was fine handling the store by myself. The inside of this Dunkin' was larger than most, with a few booths and tables scattered around. I had spent the last few hours in silence. No one had come in, and the last customer had left by 8:30 p.m. With only a few minutes left until closing, I walked around as usual, wiping down tables and making sure everything was tidy. As I passed by, heading back to the counter to clean up, something made my heart race. I hadn't noticed him before, but there was a man crouched down, almost hiding in the corner, completely out of sight from behind the counter. Everything seemed to freeze as his eyes locked with mine the moment I saw him. For a second, neither of us moved. The man slowly stood up. He was of average height, skinny, with messy hair and disheveled clothes. I asked him if he was okay, my voice trembling as I tried to stay calm. He didn't respond right away, mumbling that he was fine. I reminded him that we were closing and he needed to leave. He nodded and started walking toward the door. For a moment, I thought everything was fine, but then, without warning, he turned around and sprinted toward the counter with a crazed look on his face. Everything happened so fast. He didn't head for the door. He ran straight behind the counter, his eyes locked on the cash register. I began to realize what was happening. Without hesitation, I made for the exit, my mind racing. I didn't care about the cash register. I just needed to get out. Guys like him are dangerous, and they usually carry weapons. I had to be smart about this, but before I could reach the door, His voice rang out, loud and threatening. He shouted, his voice filled with anger. Stop. Froze for a second, but instinct kicked in, and I kept moving, my heart pounding in my chest. I pushed the door open and ran out, without looking back. I thought he would be inside to rob the store, but I was wrong. He chased after me, running through the parking lot, and fear gripped me like never before. I looked around the area, but most of the stores were dark and closed. I spotted a gas station in the distance, its lights flickering like a beacon of hope. I ran faster, my breath quickening, and he was still behind me. The distance between us seemed to shrink. I burst into the gas station, my chest heaving with each breath. It was the closest place still open. As I ran inside, I shouted for someone to call the police. My voice was panicked and full of fear, echoing through the empty space. The clerk behind the counter and a lone customer turned to look at me. Startled, I ran past them, heading straight for the back of the store. A small restroom sign caught my attention. My fingers fumbled with the lock as I rushed inside. The flickering light in the small restroom, combined with the smell of bleach, heightened my tension. I was shaking uncontrollably. Leaning against the door, I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I reached into my pocket, my hands trembling as I pulled out my phone and called the police. The dispatcher reassured me that officers were on their way, but the minutes felt like hours as I waited. I pressed my ear against the bathroom door, listening for any sign of him. Nothing. The silence was suffocating. Was he following me? Was he out there, lurking? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong and that whatever awaited me outside wasn't over. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly unlocked the bathroom door and peeked outside. The gas station was eerily silent. The cashier was no longer behind the counter, and the customer had disappeared. I cautiously stepped out further. The dim lights cast long shadows over the shelves. I walked carefully, my own footsteps suddenly too loud. My eyes darted to the door, but there was no sign of the man outside. For a brief moment, a wave of relief washed over me. Then I saw him. Through the glass window, his face appeared pale and terrifying. His wild eyes pressed against the glass like something from a nightmare. His eyes locked onto mine, a twisted smile spreading across his face. He smiled grotesquely, almost stretching from ear to ear. Then he breathed onto the glass, writing the word "run." It felt like a challenge, daring me to try escaping. He slowly dragged his finger down the window, the screeching sound sending chills down my spine. He was waiting like a predator, knowing that eventually I would have to come out. Panic surged within me again. I rushed toward the back exit, hoping it would lead to some way out. As I pushed the door open, I found myself outside again, this time in the alley behind the station. My breath fogged the cold air as I frantically looked around for somewhere to hide. The alley was narrow, with tall brick walls on either side, dark and unwelcoming. A few trash bins lined the path, but it was mostly empty. I had to make a choice. The only way out was forward or back to the gas station, where he might be waiting for me. I didn't have time to think. I started running, my body moving on instinct. As I ran, I glanced over my shoulder, nothing behind me. Still, fear gripped me tightly. This alley too dark, too unknown, leaving me vulnerable to whatever could come. I turned the corner and was met with a dead end. My heart sank as I saw the towering chain link fence blocking my way. I could hear my own breath, ragged and loud, and feel the cold sweat on my skin. Maybe there was no way out. Footsteps echoed behind me. Slow. Maybe he was coming closer. My body froze in place as the sound grew louder, the rhythm unsettling in its calmness. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. My back pressed against the cold brick wall as I realized I had no other choice but to face him. He appeared at the end of the alley, his eyes locked onto mine with that twisted smile. His steps slowed as he moved into the faint light, his shadow stretching unnaturally across the ground. In his hand, he held an iron rod. My heart was pounding in my chest. My legs were shaking. Then he spoke. "You can't run forever." His voice was low, mocking, and dragged the iron bar across the road with screeching sounds. My mind seemed to be spinning. I scanned the alley, desperately searching for anything that could help me. Without thinking, I grabbed a broken brick lying near the trash cans. I knew it wasn't enough to stop him, but I had no other choice. It was all I had. He stopped just inches from me, smirking. "You really think that's going to stop me?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. As he took one more step toward me, I swung the brick with all my strength. In the moment, he was too focused on taunting me. Turning away smugly, I threw the brick, and it hit him square in the head. For a second, everything froze. He staggered back, the smile vanishing from his face as blood trickled down his forehead. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I seized the moment and ran. I didn't look back. All I could think about was getting as far away as possible. The sound of sirens tore through the night air in the distance. The police were coming, but I didn't stop running. Right then, the screech of tires cut through the air as police cars appeared. 3 patrol cars pulled into the gas station, red and blue lights flashing furiously. I could see the officers jump out, guns drawn, moving with urgency. I tried to shout, trembling as I pointed toward the alley. "He's over there." The officer nodded quickly and signaled to the others. They disappeared into the alley, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they shouted commands. The man appeared at the mouth of the alley, running toward the parking lot. But this time he wasn't alone. The police were right behind him. His wild eyes darted in every direction as he desperately searched for a way out, but he was surrounded. The police quickly tackled him to the ground. The man struggled violently, his voice twisted with rage, sending chills down my spine. But now, I was truly safe. The flashing lights of the police cars began to fade as I sat on the cold sidewalk, trying to piece together everything that had happened. It was over, but the horror still lingered. The uninvited guest. Ava and her fiancé, Jay, decided to host a dinner party to celebrate his mother's recovery. The house was bustling with final touches on the decorations, ensuring everything was ready. She had hired a server to assist her in serving their family and friends. The server arrived on time as scheduled. As soon as he walked in, Ava noticed an unpleasant odor coming from him, which made her uncomfortable, especially since he would be preparing food for her family. But she forced a polite smile. As the server unpacked his utensils, he kept glancing at Ava, asking for her opinion on spices, telling her to taste the food, and seeking her input on presentation. But she politely said she trusted his taste, as he was the chef after all. Soon it was 5:45 p.m. Guests were about to arrive, yet he was still there. After reminding him twice, she bluntly told him she needed him to finish everything and be out by 6 o'clock. He apologized, claiming her oven wasn't maintaining the right temperature, a problem Ava had never encountered before. As guests started arriving, the server finally began packing up his things. But instead of heading to the door, he suddenly walked toward Ava's bedroom. Ava, confused and worried, called after him and asked where he was going. He mumbled something about needing to change clothes. Feeling uncomfortable, she told him there was another bathroom outside, but he ignored her and went inside, locking the door. Ava found Jay and explained the strange behavior she had noticed from the server. Together, they went to the room and demanded he come out. When he appeared, he was wearing a t-shirt and jeans, but his expression darkened. "This isn't your house." Jay told him that he was Ava's fiancé and they lived there. The server went berserk, screaming about how Ava had seduced him, babbling nonsense that she couldn't understand. Then, he rushed into the kitchen, throwing food out of the fridge and onto the floor without hesitation. He screamed obscenities, his face twisted with rage. Jay had to call on his two brothers to forcibly remove the server. Fortunately, the party still proceeded as planned. Around 5 a.m., Ava woke with a start to the sound of a door creaking open. She nudged Jay awake, whispering that someone was inside the house. He tried to reassure her, saying maybe his brother had forgotten something like his wallet. But then, the noise grew louder, coming from outside. Jay told her he'd check it out while she should hide in the closet and call 911. Before she could dial, a familiar, disturbing voice echoed through the room. She stepped into the living room and saw the server, shirtless, his eyes wild with madness. He lunged at Ava, but Jay blocked him, holding him down while she called the police. Jay warned the server, "The police are on their way," but the server just smiled, "I need to make sure she's okay and unharmed." Jay stayed between them as Ava climbed out of the window. The server broke free from Jay's grip and ran into the kitchen. Just in time, when the police arrived, the server was in the kitchen, swinging a knife wildly. He ignored the police's orders to drop the weapon, forcing them to subdue him with a taser. The police searched the entire house, finding nothing unusual except one thing. Ava suddenly remembered that he had gone into her room. Upon checking, she realized some of her clothes and personal items were missing. Afterward, Ava and Jay cleaned the house, discarding everything the server had touched. They replaced all the kitchen items and made the house feel like home again. The server was sentenced to 3 years in prison, but the trauma and violation he caused still haunted Ava. She was grateful, though, that Jay had stood by her and protected her, helping her recover from the emotional ordeal. Mysterious Treehouse. Through the dense foliage, the silhouette of a massive, weathered treehouse emerged. The house was large, its wooden structure warped and covered in vines. The treehouse seemed forgotten by time, hidden by the surrounding forest. We had been walking for hours through the forest, the trees becoming denser the deeper we went. Everything started with my friend Cody's dog. Oddly, it had gone missing for 5 days, then returned home with a strange piece of paper in its mouth. The paper looked like a toy treasure map, so I was intrigued. Cody started climbing the ladder nailed to the tree, and from above, he called down to me, telling me to hurry up and see something. I hesitated for a moment because the house seemed suspicious and strange, but I decided to follow Cody. I slowly climbed the rickety ladder to the treehouse. The closer I got, the worse the feeling became. Now, I could see the house more clearly. Through the broken windows, I could see inside the house. It was a mess, full of dust and scattered objects, yet it felt oddly alive. It was like a place of exile. The air inside the treehouse was stifling, thick with dust and an unpleasant stench. I began to look around and noticed the mess tattered old clothes scattered across the floor. In one corner, there was a mattress, stained with something black and terrible. As we moved further in, we saw the glimpse of a large, rusted iron cage among the debris. It seemed like no one had been here for years. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and told Cody.
"There's nothing here. We should leave."
But Cody wouldn't listen. He was rummaging near the cage, curious, when suddenly he froze. His eyes widened, and his face turned pale as he said,
"We need to go. Now."
Before I could ask what happened, I heard it, a voice from below, low and raspy, full of malice. "Well, Well, look who I found. I glanced out the window. A man was standing at the base of the tree, looking up at us with a sinister grin. His face was gaunt, his eyes wild, his hair long and dirty, as if he had been living in the forest for too long. Cody wasted no time and shouted,
"My dad's a cop. He's coming any minute."
The man's grin faded, and his eyes narrowed as he started to threaten that if we were lying, he wouldn't spare us. Cody was below, near the ladder, ready to run, but I was stuck because the rope ladder behind his house was about to break. If he comes up here, I won't have anywhere to go. I backed away from the window, inching closer to where the cage appeared in the darkness. My legs were shaking so badly I thought I might collapse. My back hit the cold metal of the cage, and I felt something move behind me. Something alive. I slowly turned around. Inside the cage, huddled in the shadows, was a person, but it looked more like a monster. Its skeletal frame was twisted and deformed, with ashen gray skin. Its eyes were bloodshot and wild. The creature stirred, its head slowly rising as it turned towards me, opening its mouth and reaching out as if to attack. My body froze, paralyzed with fear. I couldn't breathe. Cody called me out of there immediately, and without thinking, I rushed towards the ladder in front of the house, decided to climb down regardless of what was waiting for me down there. Courageous Cody used his entire body to stop that crazy guy from running towards me. Cody said run to my parents, and they'll know what to do. I'm worried, and he's behind. He told me to go quickly and come back. I followed the instructions and ran as fast as I could. I have to save him. Cody stayed behind, and I don't know if I'll ever see him again. When the police arrived, everything was gone, and there was no trace of anyone. 10 years have passed since that day. I never went back to the treehouse until now. The memories came flooding back as I stood at the edge of the forest, looking up at the towering oak where the treehouse still stood, weathered and decaying. The House of the Lost Child. It was 2006 when my family moved into this house. My parents decided to quit their jobs and start anew in the countryside. I was just a child then. But something about this house struck me immediately. The first thing I noticed when we moved in was the stairs. Every time I passed by, I would see a shadow silently moving up and down. It never frightened me. In fact, it felt oddly familiar. I was 6 years old, but I could always see things that others couldn't, and this house was no exception. I didn't tell my parents right away, not because I was scared, but because I felt that presence meant us no harm. Still, I was very afraid of the dark. My room was upstairs while the bathroom was downstairs. Every night, before going to bed, I would use the bathroom to avoid facing the fear of going down the stairs alone at night. But one night, my mother's voice woke me. She called out to me, angrily and irritably, telling me to come downstairs and not to run around anymore. I sat up in bed, confused. I hadn't run at all. In the following days, I kept experiencing similar incidents. My mother often scolded me for running around the house, accusing me of mischief. I had told her many times that I hadn't done it, but she never believed me. Then one night, the power went out, and we were almost engulfed in darkness, lit only by a few flickering candles in the living room. As we sat together, I saw it again, a shadow. It swayed back and forth, hovering over the sofa. My mother didn't see it, but I did. That presence was very strong but had no malice. That night, as we lay in bed, my mother and I heard a voice, soft yet clear as day. "Mom, where are you? I'm cold." That voice belonged to a child, and it came from just outside our bedroom. My mother looked at me, eyes wide with fear. As I grew older, I began to understand that the shadow wasn't there to harm us. It wasn't a ghost trying to scare us, but a lost child searching for something. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that spirit was looking for its mother. I had a friend who could sense things like I could, and they suggested that I tell the spirit to move on. So one quiet afternoon, I stood in the living room and said to the air, "I believe your mother loves you very much. You can move on. It's time to go to a happier place." The house felt different afterward. The shadow disappeared. The footsteps stopped. No more voices at night. I thought that the spirit had finally found peace, or perhaps it needed to validate something because it had been left here and unable to move on in this house. In 2018, my aunt, Tita, who had worked abroad, returned home to retire. One evening, we sat together in the living room, sharing stories. We talked about the strange occurrences that had taken place in the house over the years. I told her about that spirit, about how my mother had once mistaken it for me because it looked like a small child. I explained how I had ultimately helped it move on. As I was speaking, I noticed something. Tita, she's crying. She started telling me a story I had never heard before. Long before I was born, my grandmother, she was pregnant with Aunt Tita. Not long after that, there was a baby boy. She named her son Angelo. Suddenly one day, Grandma left and didn't come back. At that time, Aunt and Angelo were too young to know what to do in this remote suburb. So, Angelo lay on the sofa. The boy was sick and passed away in his sleep while clutching a small glass jar that his mother had given him. He was only about 3 to 4 years old. At that time, my aunt was too young to understand what was happening and thought her brother was just sleeping until one day a neighbor came and took the boy to a small coffin and buried him. Our new house sits on this land. Perhaps the boy could not move on because he was waiting and didn't know when his mother would return. Sometime later, my aunt, the boy's sister, passed away just after we talked about him. Now, standing in front of the house, I can't shake the feeling that something has changed. Then came the unmistakable sound of soft footsteps. They echoed from the hallway behind me, moving toward the stairs. I turned around, breath caught in my throat. The shadow had returned. As I climbed the stairs, I saw the shadow standing right above and sliding into my bedroom. Upon reaching the room, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and just as I was about to turn it, I heard, "Mom, where are you?" I slowly pushed the door open, the creaking hinges filling the silent house. The room was bathed in the faint light of the moon filtering through the window, casting a cold glow over everything. My heart skipped a beat as I saw Angelo. This time, he was not just a shadow. He stood in the middle of the room, a small, frail figure, unmistakably a child. His head was bowed down. Then slowly, Angelo lifted his head, and for the first time, I saw his face. A face with deep-set eyes filled with sorrow. His mouth opened, and in a voice that sent chills down my spine, he whispered, "Mom, where is she?" I wanted to tell him, to explain that she had passed away. But before I could say anything, he raised a small glass jar, looking at it as if it held an ominous energy imprisoning his soul. Angelo stood still, clutching the jar, looking at me with hollow eyes. I had to do something. I couldn't let Angelo remain trapped forever. I took a deep breath, my voice trembling as I finally spoke to Angelo, telling him that his mother was no longer here. I told him to always believe that she loved him, so I urged him to move on. For a moment, Angelo's expression softened, but then he tightened his grip on the jar. His voice rang out again, firm and more desperate. "Where is my mom? I want to see her." As if he didn't believe the words I was saying, tears welled up in my eyes as I realized there were no words that could satisfy him. He wasn't just seeking peace. He wanted his mother, and nothing else mattered more than that. I could feel the air shift, the temperature drop, and for the first time in years, I felt fear. I couldn't let him stay. I had to help him find peace. Without thinking, I stepped toward him, my hands trembling. "Angelo, I can help you find her. But first, you need to let go, to release everything." His gaze shifted from the jar to me, his hollow eyes filled with confusion and longing. Slowly, very slowly, he began to loosen his grip on the jar. As it fell from his hand and shattered on the floor, the room went silent. Angelo's figure began to fade, dissolving into the moonlight. Before he disappeared completely, I heard his voice one last time, soft, almost a whisper. "Thank you." I stood outside the house. The weight that had burdened it for years was gone. Angelo was finally free. The feeling of guilt lingered, but I knew I had finally helped him find the peace he had been searching for all these years. The love his mother had for him, the love that had anchored Angelo to this world, had freed him. Perhaps he was beginning to understand the painful truths that even I never wanted to hear. He would likely continue his journey to find his mother in another world where he truly belonged. I looked back at the house one last time. It no longer felt haunted. Now, it was just a house, quiet and still. Angelo had gone, but he left behind something much more enduring. It was a son's love for his mother, transcending the boundaries of life and death.